Chapter 30 of The Missing Bride. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Luna. The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. SOUTHWORTH. Chapter 30. Miriam. 6 years had passed away. Thurston Willcoxen was the most beloved and honored man, as well as the most distinguished clergyman of his day and state. His church was always crowded, except when he changed with some brother minister whose pulpit was within reach, in which case a great portion of his congregation followed him. Many flattering calls had the gifted and eloquent country parson received to metropolitan parishes, but he remained the faithful shepherd of his own flock as long as they would hear his voice. As Miriam grew into womanhood, prudence kept her silent on the subject of her strange vow. She, however, preserved in her memory the slight indexes that she already had in possession, namely, beginning with Marian's return after her visit to Washington, her changed manner, her fits of reverie, her melancholy when she returned empty-handed from the post-office, her joy when she received letters which she would read in secret and in silence, or when questioned concerning them, would gently but firmly decline to tell from whom or whence they came. The house-warming at Luckenough, where Marian suddenly became so bright and gay, and the evening succeeding when she returned home through night and storm, and in such anguish of mind that she wept all night, and the weeks of unexplained, unaccountable distress that followed this. All these things Miriam recalled, and studied if by any means they might direct her in the discovery of the guilty. And her faithful study had ended in her assurance of one or two facts, or one or two links perhaps we should say, in the chain of evidence. The first was that Marian's mysterious lover had been present in the neighborhood, and perhaps in the mansion at the time of the house-warming at Luckenough, that he had met her once or more, and that his name was not Thomas Truman, that the latter was an assumed name, for with all her observation and astute investigation she had not been able to find that any one of the name of Truman had ever been seen or heard of in the county. She was sure, also, that she had seen the man twice, both times in night and storm, when she had wandered forth in search of Marian. She remembered well the strange figure of that man, the tall form shrouded in the black cloak, the hat drawn over the eyes, the faint spectral gleam of the clear-cut profile, the peculiar fall of light and shade, the decided individuality of air and gait. All was distinct as a picture in her memory, and she felt sure that she would be able to identify that man again. Up to this time, the thought of her secret vow and her life's mission had afforded only a romantic and heroic excitement. But the day was fast approaching when these indexes she retained should point to a clue that should lead through a train of damning circumstantial evidence destined to test her soul by an unexampled trial. Paul Douglas had grown up to be a tall and handsome youth, of a very noble, frank, attractive countenance and manners. To say that he loved Miriam is only to say that he loved himself. She mingled with every thought and feeling and the purpose of his heart. And when, at last, the time came that Paul had to leave home for Baltimore, to remain absent all winter, for the purpose of attending the course of lectures at the medical college, Miriam learned the pain of parting, and understood how impossible happiness would be for her, with Paul away, on naval or military duty, more than half their lives, and for periods of 2, 3, or 5 years. And after that she never said another word in favor of his wearing Uncle Sam's livery, although she had often expressed a wish that he should enter the army. Miriam's affection for Paul was so profound and quiet that she did not know its depth or strength, as she had not believed that parting from him would be painful until the event had taught her. So even now she did not know how intertwined with every cord and fibre of her heart, and how identical with her life, was her love for Paul. She was occupied by a more enthusiastic devotion to her brother, as she called her guardian. The mysterious sorrow, the incurable melancholy of a man like Thurston Willcoxen could not but invest him with peculiar interest and even strange fascination for one of Miriam's enthusiastic, earnest temperament. She loved him with more than a daughter's love. She loved him with all the impassioned earnestness of her nature. Her heart yearned as it would break with its wild, intense longing to do him some good, to cure his sorrow, to make him happy. There were moments when, but for the sweet shyness that is ever the attendant and conservator of such pure feeling, this wild desire was strong enough to cast her at his feet, to embrace his knees, and with tears beseech him to let her into that dark, sorrowful bosom, to see if she could make any light and joy there. She feared that he had sinned, that his incurable sorrow was the gnawing tooth of that worm that never dieth, preying on his heart. But she doubted too, for what could he have done to plunge his soul into such a hell of remorse? He commit a crime? Impossible! The thought was treason, a sin to be repented of and expiated. His fame was fairest of the fair, his name most honoured among the honourable. If not remorse, what then was the nature of his lifelong sorrow? Many, many times she revolved this question in her mind, and as she matured in thought and affection, the question grew more earnest and importunate. Oh, that he would unburden his heart to her! Oh, that she might share and alleviate his grief! If all earnest desires are prayers, then prayer was Miriam's vital breath and native air indeed. Her soul earnestly desired, prayed, to be able to give her sorrowing brother peace. End of chapter 30. Miriam. Recording by Sandra Luna.
Chapter 31 of The Missing Bride. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. Southworth, Chapter 31. Dreams and Visions. Winter waned. Mrs. Waugh had attended the Commodore to the South for the benefit of his health, and they had not yet returned. Mrs. Morris and Alice were absent on a long visit to a relative in Washington City, and were not expected back for a month. Paul remained in Baltimore attending the medical lectures. The house at Dell Delight was very sad and lonely. The family consisted of only Thurston, Fanny, and Miriam. A change had also passed over poor Fanny's malady. She was no longer the quaint, fantastical creature, half lunatic, half seeress, singing snatches of wild songs through the house, now here, now there, now everywhere, awakening smiles and merriment in spite of pity, and keeping everyone alive about her. Her bodily health had failed, her animal spirits departed. She never sang nor smiled, but sat all day in her eerie chamber, lost in deep and concentrated study, her face having the careworn look of one striving to recall the past, to gather up and reunite the broken links of thought, memory, and understanding. At last one day Miriam received a letter from Paul, announcing the termination of the winter's course of lectures, the conclusion of the examination of medical candidates, the successful issue of his own trial in the acquisition of his diploma, and finally his speedy return home. Miriam's impulsive nature rebounded from all depressing thoughts, and she looked forward with gladness to the arrival of Paul. He came toward the last of the week. Mr. Willcoxen, roused for a moment from his sad abstraction, gave the youth a warm welcome. Miriam received him with a bashful, blushing joy. He had passed through Washington City on his way home, and had spent a day with Mrs. Morris and her friends, and he had brought away strange news of them. Alice, he said, had an accepted suitor, and would probably be a bride soon. A few days after his return, Paul found Miriam in the old wainscoted parlor, seated by the fire. She appeared to be in deep and painful thought. Her elbow rested on the circular work table. Her head was bowed upon her hand, and her face was concealed by the drooping black ringlets. "What is the matter, dear sister?" he asked, in that tender, familiar tone with which he sometimes spoke to her. "Oh, Paul, I'm thinking of our brother. Can nothing soothe or cheer him, Paul? Can nothing help him? Can we do him no good at all? Oh, Paul, I brood so much over his trouble. I long so much to comfort him, that I do believe it's beginning to affect my reason, and make me see visions and dream dreams. Tell me, do you think anything can be done for him?" "Ah, I do not know. I have just left his study, dear Miriam, where I've had a long and serious conversation with him." "And what was it about, may I know?" "You must know, dearest Miriam. It concerned yourself and me," said Paul, and he took a seat by her side and told her how much he loved her, and that he had Thurston's consent to asking her hand in marriage. Miriam replied, "Paul, there is one secret that I have never imparted to you. Not that I wish to keep it from you, but that nothing has occurred to call it out." She paused, while Paul regarded her in much curiosity. "What is it, Miriam?" he at last inquired. "I promised my dying mother, and sealed the promise with an oath, never to be a bride until I shall have been—" "What, Miriam?" "An avenger of blood." "Miriam!" It was all he said, and then he remained gazing at her as if he doubted her perfect sanity. "I am not mad, dear Paul, though you look as if you thought so. Explain yourself, dear Miriam." "I am going to do so. You remember Marian Mayfield?" she said, her face beginning to quiver with emotion. "Yes, yes. Well, you remember the time and manner of her death?" "Yes, yes." "Oh, Paul, that stormy night death fell like scattering lightning, and struck 3 places at once. But, oh, Paul, such was the consternation and grief excited by the discovery of Marian's assassination, that the 2 other sudden deaths passed almost unnoticed, except by the respective families of the deceased. Child as I was then, Paul, I think it was the tremendous shock of her sudden and dreadful death that threw me entirely out of my center, so that I have been erratic ever since. She was more than a mother to me, Paul, and if I had been born hers, I could not have loved her better. I loved her beyond all things in life. In my dispassionate, reflective moments, I am inclined to believe that I have never been quite right since the loss of Marian. Not but that I am reconciled to it, knowing that she must be happy. Only, Paul, I often feel that something is wrong here and here," said Miriam, placing her hand upon her forehead and upon her heart. "But your promise, Miriam, your promise?" questioned Paul with increased anxiety. "Aye, true. Well, Paul, I promised to devote my whole life to the pursuit and apprehension of her murderer, and never to give room in my bosom to any thought of love or marriage until that murderer should hang from the gallows, and I sealed that promise with a solemn oath." "That was all very strange, dear Miriam." "Paul, yes, it was, and it weighs upon me like lead. Paul, if 2 things could be lifted off my heart, I should be happy. I should be happy as a freed bird." "And what are they, dear Miriam? What weights are they that I have not power to lift from your heart? Surely you may surmise. The first is our brother's sadness, that oppresses my spirits all the time. The second is the memory of that unaccomplished vow. So equally do these 2 anxieties divide my thoughts, that they seem connected, seem to be parts of the same responsibility, and I even dreamed that the one could be accomplished only with the other. Dearest Miriam, let me assure you that such dreams and visions are but the effect of your isolated life. They come from an overheated brain and overstrained nerves, and you must consent to throw off those self-imposed weights and be happy and joyous as a young creature should. Alas, how can I throw them off, dear Paul? In this way. First, for my brother's lifelong sorrow, since you can neither cure nor alleviate it, turn your thoughts away from it. As for your vow, 2 circumstances combine to absolve you from it. The first is this, that you were an irresponsible infant when you were required to make it. The second is that it is impossible to perform it. These two considerations fairly release you from its obligations. Look upon these matters in this rational light, and all your dark and morbid dreams and visions will disappear, and we shall have you joyous as any young bird. Sure enough, and I assure you that your cheerfulness will be one of the very best medicines for our brother. Will you follow my advice?" "No, no, Paul, I cannot follow it in either instance. I cannot, Paul. It is impossible. I cannot steel my heart against sympathy with his sorrows, nor can I so ignore the requirements of my solemn vow. I do not by any means think its accomplishment an impossibility, nor was it in ignorance of its nature that I made it. No, Paul, I knew what I promised, and I know that its performance is possible. Therefore I cannot feel absolved. I must accomplish my work, and you, Paul, if you love me, must help me to do it. I would serve you with my life, Miriam, in anything reasonable and possible. But how can I help you? How can you discharge such an obligation? You have not even a clue." "Yes, I have a clue, Paul." "You have? What is it? Why have you never spoken of it before?" "Because of its seeming unimportance. The clue is so slight that it would be considered none at all by others less interested than myself." "What is it, then? At least allow me the privilege of knowing and judging of its importance." "I am about to do so," said Miriam, and she commenced and told him all she knew, and also all she suspected of the circumstances that preceded the assassination on the beach. In conclusion, she informed him of the letters in her possession. "And where are now those letters, Miriam? What are they like? What is their purport? It seems to me that they would not only give a hint, but afford direct evidence against that demoniac assassin, and it seems strange to me that they were not examined with a view to that end." "Paul, they were, but they did not point out the writer even. There was a note among them, a note soliciting a meeting with Marian upon the very evening and upon the very spot when and where the murder was committed, but that note contained nothing to indicate the identity of its author. There are, besides, a number of foreign letters written in French and signed Thomas Truman, no French name, by the by, a circumstance which leads me to believe that it must have been an assumed one." "And those French letters give no indication of the writer either?" "I am not sufficiently acquainted with that language to read it in manuscript, which you know is much more difficult than print, but I presume they point to nothing definitely, for my dear mother showed them to Mr. Willcoxen, who took the greatest interest in the discovery of the murderer, and he told her that those letters afforded not the slightest clue to the perpetrator of the crime, and that whoever might have been the assassin, it certainly could not have been the author of those letters. He wished to take them with him, but mother declined to give them up. She thought it would be disrespect to Marian's memory to give her private correspondence up to a stranger, and so she told him. He then said that of all men, certainly, he had the least right to claim them, and so the matter rested. But mother always believed they held the key to the discovery of the guilty party, and afterward she left them to me, with the charge that I should never suffer them to pass from my possession until they had fulfilled their destiny of witnessing against the murderer. For whatever Mr. Willcoxen might think, mother felt convinced that the writer of those letters and the murderer of Marian was the same person." "Tell me more about those letters." "Dear Paul, I know nothing more about them. I told you that I was not sufficiently familiar with the French language to read them. But it is strange that you never made yourself acquainted with their contents by getting someone else to read them for you. Dear Paul, you know that I was a mere child when they first came into my possession, accompanied with a charge that I should never part with them until they had done their office. I felt bound by my promise. I was afraid of losing them, and of those persons that I could trust. None knew French except our brother, and he had already pronounced them irrelevant to the question. Besides, for many reasons, I was shy of intruding upon brother. Does he know that you have the packet?" "I suppose he does not even know that." "I confess," said Paul, that if Thurston believed them to have no connection with the murder, I have so much confidence in his excellent judgment that I am inclined to reverse my hasty opinion, and to think as he does, at least until I see the letters. I remember, too, that the universal opinion at that time was that the poor young lady had fallen a victim to some marauding waterman, the most likely thing to have happened. But to satisfy you, Miriam, if you will trust me with those letters, I will give them a thorough and impartial study, and then, if I find no clue to the perpetrator of that diabolical deed, I hope, Miriam, that you will feel yourself free from the responsibility of pursuing the unknown demon, a pursuit which I consider worse than a wild goose chase. They were interrupted by the entrance of the boy with a mail-bag. Paul emptied the contents of it upon the table. There were letters for Mr. Willcoxen, for Miriam, and for Paul himself. Those for Mr. Willcoxen were sent up to him by the boy. Miriam's letter was from Alice Morris, announcing her approaching marriage with Olive Murray, a young lawyer of Washington, and inviting and entreating Miriam to come to the city and be her bridesmaid. Paul's letters were from some of his medical classmates. By the time they had read and discussed the contents of their epistles, a servant came in to replenish the fire and lay the cloth for tea. When Mr. Willcoxen joined them at supper, he laid a letter on Miriam's lap, informing her that it was from Mrs. Morris, who advised them of her daughter's intended marriage and prayed them to be present at the ceremony. Miriam replied that she had received communications to the same effect. "Then, my dear, we will go up to Washington and pass a few weeks, and attend this wedding, and see the inauguration of General Stone. You lead too lonely a life for one of your years, love. I see it affects your health and spirits. I have been too selfish and oblivious of you in my abstraction, dear child. But it shall be so no longer. You shall enter upon the life better suited to your age." Miriam's eyes thanked his care. For many a day Thurston had not come thus far out of himself, and his doing so now was hailed as a happy omen by the young people. Their few preparations were soon completed, and on the first day of March they went to Washington City. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Missing Bride. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. Southworth, Chapter 32. Discoveries. On arriving at Washington, our party drove immediately to the mansion house where they had previously secured rooms. The city was full of strangers from all parts of the country, drawn together by the approaching inauguration of one of the most popular presidents that ever occupied the White House. As soon as our party made known their arrival to their friends, they were inundated with calls and invitations. Brother clergymen called upon Mr. Willcoxen, and pressed upon him the freedom of their houses. Alice Morris and Mrs. Moulton, the relative with whom she was staying, called upon Miriam and insisted that she should go home with them, to remain until after the wedding. But these offers of hospitality were gratefully declined by the little set, who preferred to remain together at their hotel. The whole scene of metropolitan life, in its most stirring aspect, was entirely new and highly interesting to our rustic beauty. Amusements of every description were rife. The theatres, exhibition halls, saloons, and concert rooms held out their most attractive temptations, and night after night were crowded with the gay votaries of fashion and of pleasure, while the churches and lyceums and lecture rooms had greater charms for the more seriously inclined. The old and the young, the grave and the gay, found no lack of occupation, amusement, and instruction to suit their several tastes or varying moods. The second week of their visit, the marriage of Alice Morris and Oliver Murray came off, Miriam serving as bridesmaid, Dr. Douglas as groomsman, and Mr. Willcoxen as officiating minister. But it is not with these marriage festivities that we have to do, but with the scenes, that immediately succeed them. From the time of Mr. Wilcoxon's arrival in the city, he had not ceased to exercise his sacred calling. His fame had long before preceded him to the capital, and since his coming he had been frequently solicited to preach and to lecture. Not from love of notoriety, nor from any such ill-placed vainglory, but from the wish to relieve some overtasked brother of the heat and burden of at least one day, and possibly by presenting truth in a newer and stronger light to do some good, did Thurston Willcoxen, Sabbath after Sabbath, and evening after evening, preach in the churches or lecture before the Lyceum. Crowds flocked to hear him. The press spoke highly of his talents and his eloquence. The people warmly echoed the opinion, and Mr. Willcoxen, against his inclination, became the clerical celebrity of the day. But from all this unsought world worship he turned away a weary, sickened, sorrowing man. There was but one thing in all the world outside that strongly interested him. It was a still small voice, a low-toned, sweet music, keeping near the dear Mother Earth and her humble children, yet echoed and re-echoed from sphere to sphere. It was the name of a lady, young, lovely, accomplished, and wealthy, who devoted herself, her time, her talents, and her fortune to the cause of suffering humanity. This young lady, whose beauty, goodness, wisdom, eloquence, and powers of persuasion were rumored to be almost miraculous, had founded schools and asylums, and had collected by subscription a large amount of money with which she was coming to America to select and purchase a tract of land to settle a colony of the London poor. This angel girl's name and fame was a low, sweet echo, as I said before, never noisy, never rising high, keeping near the ground. People spoke of her in quiet places, and dropped their voices to gentle tones in mentioning her and her works. Such was the spell it exercised over them. This lady's name possessed the strangest fascination for Thurston Willcoxen. He read eagerly whatever was written of her. He listened with interest to whatever was spoken of her. Her name, it was that of his loved and lost Marian. That in itself was a spell. But that was not the greatest charm. Her character resembled that of his Marian. How like my Marian would often be the language of his heart when hearing of her deeds. Even so would my Marian have done had she been born to fortune as this lady was. The name was certainly common enough, yet the similarity of both names and natures inclined him to the opinion that this angel woman must be some distant and more fortunate relative of his own lost Marian. He felt drawn toward the unknown lady by a strong and almost irresistible attraction, and he secretly resolved to see and know her, and pondered in his heart ways and means by which he might, with propriety, seek her acquaintance. While thus he lived two lives, the outer life of work and usefulness, and the inner life of thought and suffering. The young people of his party, hoping and believing him to be enjoying the honors heaped upon him, yielded themselves up to the attractions of society. Miriam spent much of her time with her friend Alice Murray. One morning, when she called on Alice, the latter invited her visitor up into her own chamber, and seating her there, said with a mysterious air, "Do you know, Miriam, that I have something, the strangest thing that ever was, that I've been wanting to tell you for 3 or 4 days now, only I never got an opportunity to do so, because Ollie or someone was always present. But now Ollie has gone to court, and mother has gone to market, and you and I can have a cozy chat to ourselves." She stopped to stir the fire, and Miriam quietly waited for her to proceed. "Now, why in the world don't you ask me for my secret? I declare you take so little interest and show so little curiosity that it's not a bit of fun to hint a mystery to you. Do you want to hear or don't you? I assure you it's a tremendous revelation, and it concerns you too." "What is it then? I'm anxious to hear." "Oh, you do begin to show a little interest, and now to punish you, I have a great mind not to tell you. However, I will take pity upon your suspense. But first you must promise never, 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 to mention it again. Will you promise? Yes. Well then, listen. Stop. Get a good place to faint first, and then listen. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3, fire. The Reverend Thurston Willcoxen is a married man. What? Mr. Thurston Willcoxen has been married for 8 years past. Pshaw! Mr. Willcoxen was married 8 years ago this spring at a little Methodist chapel near the Navy Yard of this city, and by an old Methodist preacher of the name of John Berry. You are certainly mad. I am not mad, most noble doubter, but speak the words of truth and soberness. Mr. Willcoxen was married privately, when and where I said, to a beautiful, fair-haired lady whose name heard in the ritual was Marian. And my husband, Ollie Murray, was the secret witness of that private marriage. A wild scream that seemed to split the heart from whence it arose broke from the lips of Miriam. Springing forward, she grasped the wrist of Alice, and with her wild eyes straining from their sockets, gazed into her face, crying, Tell me that you've jested. Tell me that you've lied. Speak, speak. I told you the Lord's blessed truth, and Ollie knows it. But Miriam, for goodness sake, don't look that way. You scare me almost to death. And whatever you do, never let anybody know that I told you this, because if you did, Ollie would be very much grieved at me, for he confided it to me as a dead secret, and bound me up to secrecy too. But I thought, as it concerned you so much, it would be no harm to tell you, if you'd not tell it again, and so when I was promising, I made a mental reservation in favor of yourself, and so I have told you, and now you mustn't betray me, Miriam. It is false. All that you have told me is false. Say that it is false. Tell me so. Speak, speak, cried Miriam wildly. It is not false. It is true as gospel, every word of it. Nor is it any mistake, because Ollie saw the whole thing and told me all about it. The way of it was that Ollie overheard them in the Congressional Library arranging the marriage. The gentleman was going to depart for Europe, and wished to secure the lady's hand before he went. And at the same time, for some reason or other, he wished the marriage to be kept secret. Ollie owns that it was none of his business, but that curiosity got the upper hand of him. So he listened, and he heard them call each other Thurston and Marian. And when they left the library, he followed them, and so unseen he witnessed the private marriage ceremony at which they still answered to the names of Thurston and Marian. He did not hear the surnames. He never saw the bride again, and he never saw the bridegroom until he saw Mr. Willcoxen at our wedding. The moment Ollie saw him, he knew that he had seen him before, but he couldn't call to mind when or where, and the oftener he looked at him, the more convinced he became that he had seen him first under some very singular circumstances. And when at last Ollie heard his first name called Thurston, the whole truth flashed on him at once. He remembered everything connected with the mysterious marriage. I wonder what Mr. Willcoxen has done with his Marian, or whether she died, or whether she lives, or where he hides her. Well, some men are a mystery, don't you think so, Miriam? But only deep and shuddering groans, upheaving from the poor girl's bosom, answered her. Miriam, oh, don't go on so. What do you mean? Indeed, you alarm me. Oh, don't take it so to heart. Indeed, I wouldn't if I were you. I should think it's the funniest kind of fun. Miriam, I say. She answered not. She had sunk down on the floor, utterly crushed by the weight of misery that had fallen upon her. Miriam, now what in the world do you mean by this? Why do you yield so? I would not do it. I know it is bad to be disappointed of an expected inheritance, and to find out that someone else had a greater claim. But indeed I would not take it to heart so if I were you. Why, if he is married, he may not have a family, and even if he has, he may not utterly disinherit you. And even if he should, I would not grieve myself to death about it if I were you. Miriam, look up, I say. But the hapless girl replied not, heard not, heeded not. Deaf, blind, insensible was she to all, everything but to that sharp mental grief that seemed so like physical pain, that fierce anguish of the breast that like an iron band seemed to clutch and close upon her heart, tighter, 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 until it stopped the current of her blood and arrested her breath and threw her into convulsions. Alice sprang to raise her, then ran downstairs to procure restoratives and assistance. In the front hall she met Dr. Douglas, who had just been admitted by the waiter. To his pleasant greeting she replied hastily, breathlessly, "Oh, Paul, come quickly upstairs. Miriam has fallen into convulsions, and I am frightened out of my senses." "What caused her illness?" asked Paul in alarm and anxiety, as he ran upstairs, preceded by Alice. "Oh, I don't know," answered Alice, but thought to herself, "It could not have been what I said to her, and if it was, I must not tell." The details of sickness are never interesting. I shall not dwell upon Miriam's illness of several weeks. The doctors pronounced it to be angina pectoris, a fearful and often fatal complaint, brought on in those constitutionally predisposed to it by any sudden shock to mind or body. What could have caused its attack upon Miriam they could not imagine, and Alice Murray, in fear and doubt, held her tongue and kept her own counsel. In all her illness Miriam's reason was not for a moment clouded. It seemed preternaturally awake, but she spoke not, and it was observed that if Mr. Willcoxen, who was overwhelmed with distress by her dreadful illness, approached her bedside and touched her person, she instantly fell into spasms. In grief and dismay, Thurston's eyes asked of all around an explanation of this strange and painful phenomenon, but none could tell him, except the doctor, who pronounced it the natural effect of the excessive nervous irritability attending her disease, and urged Mr. Willcoxen to keep away from her chamber, and Thurston sadly complied. Youth and an elastic constitution prevailed over disease, and Miriam was raised from the bed of death, but so changed in person and in manner that you would scarcely have recognized her. She was thinner, but not paler. An intense consuming fire burned in and out upon her cheek, and smouldered and flashed from her eye. Self-concentrated and reserved, she replied not at all, or only in monosyllables, to the words addressed to her, and withdrew more into herself. At length Dr. Douglas advised their return home, and therefore they set out, and upon the last of March approached Dell Delight. The sky was overcast, the ground was covered with snow, the weather was damp and very cold for the last of March. As evening drew on, and the leaden sky lowered, and the chill damp penetrated the comfortable carriage in which they travelled, Mr. Willcoxen redoubled his attentions to Miriam, carefully wrapping her cloak and furs about her, and letting down the leathern blinds and the damask hangings to exclude the cold. But Miriam shrank from his touch, and shivered more than before, and drew closely into her own corner. "Poor child, the cold nips and shrivels her as it does a tropical flower," said Thurston, desisting from his efforts after he had tucked a woolen shawl around her feet. "It is really very unseasonable weather. There is snow in the atmosphere. I don't wonder it pinches Miriam," said Paul Douglas. Ah, they did not either of them know that it was a spiritual fever and ague, alternately burning and freezing her very heart's blood. Hope and fear, love and loathing, pity and horror, that striving together made a pandemonium of her young bosom. Like a flight of fiery arrows came the coincidences of the tale she had heard and the facts she knew. That spring, 8 years before, Mr. Murray said he had unseen witnessed the marriage of Thurston Willcoxen and Marian. That spring, 8 years before, she knew Mr. Willcoxen and Miss Mayfield had been together on a visit to the capital. Thurston had gone to Europe. Marian had returned home, but had never seemed the same since her visit to the city. The very evening of the housewarming at Luckenough, where Marian had betrayed so much emotion, Thurston had suddenly returned and presented himself at that mansion. Yet in all the months that followed she had never seen Thurston and Marian together. Thurston was paying marked and constant attention to Miss Leroy, while Marian's heart was consumed with a secret sorrow and anxiety that she refused to communicate even to Edith. How distinctly came back to her mind those nights when, lying by Marian's side, She had put her hand over upon her face and felt the tears on her cheeks. Those tears, the recollection of them now, and in this connection, filled her heart with indescribable emotion. Her mother, too, had died in the belief that Marian had fallen by the hands of her lover or her husband. Lastly, upon the same night of Marian's murder, Thurston Willcoxen had been unaccountably absent during the whole night from the deathbed of his grandfather. And then his incurable melancholy from that day to this, his melancholy augmented to anguish at the annual return of this season. And then rising in refutation of all the evidence was his own irreproachable life and elevated character. But she had, young as she was, heard of such cases before, how in some insanity of selfishness or frenzy of passion a crime had been perpetrated by one previously and afterward irreproachable in conduct. Piercing wound after wound smote these thoughts like swift coming arrows. A young immature woman, a girl of 17, in whose warm nature, passion, and imagination so largely predominated over intellect, was but too liable to have her reason shaken from its seat by the ordeal through which she was forced to go. As night descended, and they drew near Del Delight, the storm that had been lowering all the afternoon came upon them. The wind, the hail, and the snowdrifts continually forming, rendered the roads that were never very good now nearly impassable. More and more obstructed, difficult, and unrecognizable became their way, until at last, when within eighth of a mile of the house, the horses stepped off the road into a covered gully, and the carriage was overturned and broken. "Miriam, dear child, are you hurt?" was the first anxious exclamation of both gentlemen. No one was injured. The coach lay upon its left side, and the right side door was over their heads. Paul climbed out first, and then gave his hand to Miriam, whom Mr. Willcoxen assisted up to the window. Lastly followed Thurston. The horses had kicked themselves free of the carriage, and stood kicking yet. 2 wheels and the pole are broken. Nothing can be done to remove the carriage tonight. You'd better leave the horses where they are, Paul, and let us hurry on to get Miriam under shelter first. Then we can send someone to fetch them home. They were near the park gate, and the road from there to the mansion was very good. Paul was busy in bundling Miriam up in her cloak, shawls, and furs, and then Mr. Willcoxen approached to raise her in his arms and take her through the snow. But "No, no," said Miriam, shuddering and crouching closely to Paul. Little knowing her thoughts, Mr. Willcoxen slightly smiled, and pulling his hat low over his eyes, and turning up his fur collar, wrapping his cloak closely around him, he strode on rapidly before them. The snow was blowing in their faces, but drawing Miriam fondly to his side, Paul hurried after him. When they reached the park gate, Thurston was laboring to open it against the drifted snow. He succeeded, and pushed the gate back to let them pass. Miriam, as she went through, raised her eyes to his form. There he stood, in night and storm, his tall form shrouded in the long black cloak, the hat drawn over his eyes, the faint spectral gleam of the snow striking upward to his clear-cut profile, the peculiar fall of ghostly light and shade, the strong individuality of air and attitude. With a half-stifled shriek, Miriam recognized the distinct picture of the man she had seen twice before with Marian. "What is the matter, love? Were you near falling? Give me your arm, Miriam. You need us both to help you through the storm," said Thurston, approaching her. But with a shiver that ran through all her frame, Miriam shrank closer to Paul, who, with affectionate pride, renewed his care, and promised that she should not slip again. So link after link of the fearful evidence wound itself around her consciousness, which struggled against it like Laocoon in the fatal folds of the serpent. Now cold as if the blood were turned to ice in her veins, now burning as if they ran fire, she was hurried on into the house. They were expected home, and old Jenny had fires in all the occupied rooms, and supper ready to go on the table that was prepared in the parlor. But Miriam refused all refreshment and hurried to her room. It was warmed and lighted by old Jenny's care, and the good creature followed her young mistress with affectionate proffers of aid. Wouldn't she have a strong cup of tea? Wouldn't she have a hot bath? Wouldn't she have her bed warmed? Wouldn't she have a bowl of nice hot mulled wine? Dear, dear, she was so sorry, but it would have frightened herself to death if the carriage had upset with her, and no wonder Miss Miriam was knocked up entirely. No, no, no. Miriam would have nothing, and old Jenny reluctantly left her to repose. Ah, no, with fever in her veins, to walk up and down the floor of her room with fearful unrest, up and down until the candle burned low and sunk drowned in its socket, until the fire on the hearth smouldered and went out, until the stars in the sky waned with the coming day, until the rising sun kindled all the eastern horizon. And then, attired as she was, she sank upon the outside of her bed and fell into a heavy sleep of exhaustion. She arose unrefreshed, and after a hasty toilet descended to the breakfast parlor, where she knew the little family awaited her. "The journey and the fright have been too much for you, love. You look very weary. You should have rested longer this morning," said Mr. Willcoxen affectionately, as he arose and met her and led her to the most comfortable seat near the fire. His fine countenance, elevated, grave, and gentle in expression, his kind and loving manner, smote all the tender chords of Miriam's heart. Could that man be guilty of the crime she had dared to suspect him of? Oh, no, 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 never! Every lineament of his face, every inflection of his voice, as well as every act of his life, and every trait of his character, forbade the dreadful imputation. But then the evidence, the damning evidence! Her thoughts reeled with a doubt as she sank into the seat he offered her. "Ring for breakfast, Paul. Our little housekeeper will feel better when she gets a cup of coffee." But Miriam sprang up to anticipate him, and drew her chair to the table, and nervously began to arrange the cups and put sugar and cream into them, with a vague feeling that she must act as usual to avoid calling observation upon herself, for if questioned, how could she answer inquiries, and whom could she make a confidant in her terrible suspicions? And so through the breakfast scene, and so through the whole day, she sought to exercise self-control. But could her distress escape the anxious, penetrating eyes of affection? That evening after tea, when Mr. Willcoxen had retired to his own apartments, and the waiter had replenished the fire and trimmed the lamps and retired, leaving the young couple alone in the parlor, Miriam, sitting on one side of the circular work table, bending over her sewing, and Paul on the other side, with a book in his hand, he suddenly laid the volume down, and went round and drew a chair to Miriam's side, and began to tell her how much he loved her, how dear her happiness was to him, and so entreat her to tell him the cause of her evident distress. As he spoke, she became paler than death, and suddenly and passionately exclaimed, "Oh, Paul, Paul, do not question me. You know not what you ask." "My own Miriam, what mean you? I ought to know." "Oh, Paul, Paul, I am one foredoomed to bring misery and destruction upon all who love me, upon all whom I love." "My own dearest, you are ill, and need change, and you shall have it, Miriam," he said, attempting to soothe her with that gentle, tender, loving manner he ever used towards her. But shuddering sighs convulsed her bosom, and "Oh, Paul, Paul," was all she said. "Is it that promise that weighs upon your mind, Miriam? Cast it out. You cannot fulfill it. Impossibilities are not duties." "Oh, Paul, would heaven it were impossible, or that I were dead." "Miriam, where are those letters you wished to show me?" "Oh, do not ask me, Paul. Not yet, not yet. I dread to see them. And yet, who knows? They may relieve this dreadful suspicion. They may point to another probability," she said incoherently. "Just get me those letters, dear Miriam," he urged gently. she arose, tottering, and left the room, and after an absence of 15 minutes, returned with a packet in her hand. "These seals have not been broken since my mother closed them," said Miriam, as she proceeded to open the parcel. The first she came to was the bit of a note, without date or signature, making the fatal appointment. "This, Paul," she said mournfully, "was found in the pocket of the dress Marian wore at Luckenough, but changed at home before she went out to walk that evening of her death. Mother always believed that she went out to meet the appointment made in that note." Paul took the paper with eager curiosity to examine it. He looked at it, started slightly, turned pale, shuddered, and passed his hand once or twice across his eyes, as if to clear his vision, looked again, and then his cheeks blanched. His lips gradually whitened and separated, his eyes started, and his whole countenance betrayed consternation and horror. Miriam gazed upon him in a sort of hushed terror, and then exclaimed, "Paul, Paul, what is the matter? You look as if you'd been turned to stone by gazing on the Gorgon's head. Paul, Paul!" "Miriam, did your mother know this handwriting?" he asked in a husky, almost inaudible voice. "No." "Did she suspect it?" "No." "Did you know or suspect it?" "No. I was a child when I received it, remember? I have never seen it since." "Not when you put it in my hand just now?" "No, I never looked at the writing." "That was most strange, that you should not have glanced at the handwriting when you handed it to me. Why didn't you? Were you afraid to look at it, Miriam? Why do you turn away your head, Miriam? Answer me. Do you know the handwriting?" "No, Paul, I do not know it. Do you?" "No, no. How should I? But, Miriam, your head is still averted. Your very voice is changed. Miriam, what mean you? Tell me once for all. Do you suspect the handwriting?" "How should I? Do you, Paul?" "No, no, I don't suspect it." They seemed afraid to look each other in the face, and well they might be. For the written agony on either brow, they seemed afraid to hear the sound of each other's words, and well they might be, for the hollow, unnatural sound of either voice. "It cannot be. I'm crazy, I believe. Let me clear my oh heaven, Miriam, do you know whether there was anyone in particular on familiar terms with Miss Mayfield?" "No one out of the family except Miss Thornton." "Out of the family? Out of what family?" "Ours at the cottage." I wonder if my brother knew her intimately." "I do not know. I never saw them in each other's company but twice in my life." The youth breathed a little freer. "Why did you ask, Paul?" "No matter, Miriam. Oh, I was a wretch, a beast to think." "What, Paul?" "There are such strange resemblances in What are you looking at me so for, Miriam?" "To find your meaning." "In what, Paul? Strange resemblances in what?" "Why, in faces." "Why, then, so there are, and in persons also, and sometimes in fates. But we were talking of handwritings, Paul." "Were we? Oh, true. I'm not quite right, Miriam. I believe I have confined myself too much and studied too hard. I am really out of sorts. Never mind me. Please hand me those foreign letters, love." Miriam was unfolding and examining them, but all in a cold, stony, unnatural way. "Paul," she asked, "wasn't it just 8 years this spring since your brother went to Scotland to fetch you?" "Yes. Why?" "Wasn't it to Glasgow that he went?" "Yes. Why?" "Were not you there together in March and April, 1828? "Once more, yes. Why do you inquire?" "Because all these foreign letters directed to Marian are postmarked Glasgow and dated March or April, 1828. With a low stifled cry and a sudden spring, he snatched the packet from her hand, tore open the first letter that presented itself, and ran his strained, bloodshot eyes down the lines. Half suppressed, deep groans, like those wrung by torture from a strong man's heart, burst from his pale lips, and great drops of sweat gathered on his agonized forehead. And then he crushed the letters together in his hand and held them tightly, unconsciously, while his starting eyes were fixed on vacancy and his frozen lips muttered. In a fit of frantic passion, anger, jealousy, even he might have been maddened to the pitch of doing such a thing. But as an act of base policy, as an act of forethought, oh, never, never, never! Paul, speak to me, Paul. Tell me what you think. I've had foreshadowings long. I can bear silence and uncertainty no longer. What find you in those letters? Oh, speak, or my heart will burst, Paul. He gave no heed to her or her words, but remained like one impaled, still fixed, yet writhing his features, his whole form and expression discolored, distorted with inward agony. Paul, cried Miriam, starting up and standing before him, gazing on him. Paul, speak to me. Your looks kill me. Speak, Paul, even though you can tell me little new. I know it all, Paul, or nearly all. Weeks ago I received the shock. It overwhelmed me for the time, but I survived it. But you, Paul, you! Oh, how you look! Speak to your sister, Paul. Speak to your promised wife. But he gave no heed to her. She was not strong or assured. She felt herself tottering on the very verge of death or madness, but she could not bear to see him looking so. Once more she essayed to engage his attention. Give me those letters, Paul. I can perhaps make out the meaning. As he did not reply, she gently sought to take them from his hand, but at her touch he suddenly started up and threw the packet into the fire. With a quick spring, Miriam darted forward, thrust her hand into the fire, and rescued the packet, scorched and burning, but not destroyed. She began to put it out, regardless of the pain to her hands. He looked as if he were tempted to snatch it from her, but she exclaimed, "No, Paul, no. You will not use force to deprive me of this that I must guard as a sacred trust." Still Paul hesitated, and eyed the packet with a gloomy glance. "Remember honor, Paul, even in this trying moment," said Miriam. "Let honor be saved, if all else be lost." "What do you mean to do with that packet?" he asked in a hollow voice. "Keep them securely for the present, and afterward I know not." "Miriam, you evade my questions. Will you promise me one thing?" "And what is that?" "Promise me to do nothing with those letters until you have further evidence." "I promise you that." Then Paul took up a candle and left the room as if to go to his sleeping apartment. But on reaching the hall, he threw down and extinguished the light, and rushed as if for breath out into the open air. The night was keen and frosty. The cold, slaty sky was thickly studded with sparkling stars. The snow was crusted over. It was a fine, fresh, clear, wintry night. At another time it would have invigorated and inspired him. Now the air seemed stifling, the scene hateful. The horrible suspicion of his brother's criminality had entered his heart for the first time, and it had come with a shock of certainty. The sudden recognition of the handwriting, the strange revelations of the foreign letters, had not only in themselves been a terrible disclosure, but had struck the whole electric chain of memory and association, and called up in living force many an incident and circumstance heretofore strange and incomprehensible, but now only too plain and indicative. The whole of Thurston's manner, the fatal day of the assassination, his abstraction, his anxious haste to get away on the plea of the most urgent business in Baltimore, business that never was afterward heard of, his mysterious absence of the whole night from his grandfather's deathbed, provoking the conjecture at the time, and unaccounted for to this day, his haggard and distracted looks upon returning late the next morning, his incurable sorrow, his habit of secluding himself upon the anniversary of that crime, and now the damning evidence in these letters. Among them, and the first he looked at, was the letter Thurston had written Marian to persuade her to accompany him to France, in the course of which his marriage with her was repeatedly acknowledged, being incidentally introduced as an argument in favor of her compliance with his wishes. Yet Paul could not believe the crime ever premeditated. It was sudden, unintentional, consummated in a lover's quarrel, in a fit of jealousy, rage, disappointment, madness. stumbling upon half the truth, he said to himself. Perhaps, failing to persuade her to fly with him to France, he had attempted to carry her off, and being foiled, had temporarily lost his self-control, his very sanity. That would account for all that had seemed so strange in his conduct the day and night of the assassination and the morning after. There was agony, there was madness in the pursuit of the investigation. O pitying heaven, how thought and grief surged and seethed in aching heart and burning brain. And Miriam's promise to her dying mother, Miriam's promise to bring the criminal to justice. Would she, could she now abide by its obligations? Could she prosecute her benefactor, her adopted brother, for murder? Could her hand be raised to hurl him down from his pride of place to shame and death? No, 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 the vow must be broken, must be evaded. The right, even if it were the right, must be transgressed. Heaven offended anything but the exposure and sacrifice of their brother. If he had sinned, had he not repented? Did he not suffer? What right had she, his ward, his protege, his child, to punish him? Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. No, Miriam must not keep her vow. She must, responded the moral sense, slow, measured, dispassionate as the regular fall of a clock's hammer. I will myself prevent her. I will find means, arguments, and persuasions to act upon her. I will so appeal to her affections, her gratitude, her compassion, her pride, her fears, her love for me. I will so work upon her heart that she will not find courage to keep her vow. She will, responded the deliberate conscience. And so he walked up and down. Vainly the fresh wind fanned his fevered brow. Vainly the sparkling stars glanced down from holy heights upon him. He found no coolness for his fever in the air, no sedative for his anxiety in the stillness, no comfort for his soul in the heavens. He knew not whether he were indoors or out, whether it were night or day, summer or winter, he knew not, wrapped as he was in the mantle of his own sad thoughts, suffering as he was in the purgatory of his inner life. While Paul walked up and down like a maniac, Miriam returned to her room to pace the floor until nearly morning, when she threw herself exhausted upon the bed, fell into a heavy sleep, and a third time, doubtless from nervous excitement or prostration, suffered a repetition of her singular vision, and awoke late in the morning with the words, "Perform thy vow," ringing in her ears. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Missing Bride. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. Southworth, Chapter 33. The Avenger. Several days passed in the gloomy mansion misnamed Del Delight. Miriam and Paul avoided each other like death. Both dreaded like death any allusion to the awful subject that lay so heavy upon the heart of each. Paul, unacquainted with her thoughts, and relying upon her promise to do nothing with the letters without further evidence, contented himself with watching her motions, feeling comparatively at ease as long as she should remain in the house, and being resolved to prevent her from going forth, or to accompany her if she persisted in leaving home. With Miriam, the shock, the anguish, the struggle had well nigh passed. She was at once subdued and resolved, like one into whom some spirit had entered and bound her own spirit, and acted through her. So strange did all appear to her, so strange the impassiveness of her own will, of her habits and affections, that should have rebelled and warred against her purpose, that she sometimes thought herself not herself, or insane, or the subject of a monomania, or some strange hallucination, a dreamer, a somnambulist perhaps. And yet with matchless tact and discretion she went about her deadly work. She had prepared her plan of action, and now waited only for a day very near at hand, the 4th of April, the anniversary of Marian's assassination, to put Thurston to a final test before proceeding further. The day came at last. It was cold and wintry for the season. Toward evening the sky became overcast with leaden clouds, and the chill dampness penetrated into all the rooms of the old mansion. Poor Fanny was muttering and moaning to herself and her spirits over the wood fire in her distant room. Mr. Willcoxen had not appeared since breakfast time. Miriam remained in her own chamber, and Paul wandered restlessly from place to place through all the rooms of the house, or threw himself wearily into his chair before the parlour fire. Inclement as the weather was, he would have gone forth, but that he too remembered the anniversary, and a nameless anxiety connected with Miriam confined him to the house. In the kitchen the coloured folk gathered round the fire, grumbling at the unseasonable coldness of the weather, and predicting a hailstorm, and telling each other that they never experienced such weather this time o' year, 'cept 'twas that spring old Marse died, when no wonder, considerin' how he lived long o' Sam all his life. Only old Jenny went in and out from house to kitchen. Old Jenny had enough to do to carry wood to the various fires. She had never seed it so cold for this season neither, 'cept 'twas this spring Miss Marian went to heaven, and not a bit o' wonder that year was cold arter she was gone. The dear loving heart, warm angel, deed I wondered how it ever come summer again, and thought it was right down unsensible in her morning glories to bloom out just the same as ever arter she was gone. And what minds me to speak o' Miss Marian now? It was just 7 years this night since she parted this life," said Jenny, and she stood leaning her head upon the mantelpiece and toasting her toes at the kitchen fire, previous to carrying another armful of wood into the parlour. Night and the storm descended together. Such a tempest! Such a wild outbreaking of the elements! Rain and hail and snow and wind, all warring upon the earth together. The old house shook. The doors and windows rattled. The timbers cracked. The shingles were torn off and whirled aloft. The trees were swayed and snapped, and as the storm increased in violence and roused to fury, the forest beat before its might, and the waves rose and overflowed the lowland. Still old Jenny went in and out of the house, to kitchen and kitchen to house, carrying wood, water, meat, bread, sauce, sweetmeats, arranging the table for supper, replenishing the fire, lighting the candles, letting down the curtains, and trying to make everything cozy and comfortable for the reassembling of the fireside circle. Poor old Jenny had passed so much of her life in the family with the white folks that all her sympathies went with them, and on the state of their spiritual atmosphere depended all her cheerfulness and comfort. And now the cool, distant, sorrowful condition of the members of the little family circle, every single mother, son, and daughter of 'em, superambulated off to theirselves like prisoners in a jailhouse, as she said, depressed her spirits very much. Jenny's reaction from depression was always quite querulous, and toward the height of the storm there was a reaction, and she grew very quarrelsome. "Sam's wasting round in there," said Jenny, as she thrust her feet into the kitchen fire before carrying in the urn. "Sam's wasting, I tells you, all good, all very quiet though, no noise, no falling out, no sputtin' nor nothin', all quiet as the yeth just before a devil of a storm. Nobody in the parlour 'cept his Marse Paul, settin' right afore the parlour fire, with one long leg poked east and t'other west, with the boots on the andirons, and like a spread eagle, looking as glum as if I owed him years' sarvice, and never so much as a saying, 'Jenny, You poor old devil, ain't you a cold? And me comin' in every minute with the icicles a jinglin' round my linsey woolsey skirts, like the diamonds on the Virgin Mary's Sunday gown. But Sam's wastin' now, I tells you all good. Lors Gemini, what a storm! I members of no such since that same storm as the devil came in to fetch old Mar's soul. This very night, 7 year past, and he carried him off all of a sudden, whiff, just like a puff of wind, and no wonder, seeing how he done traded his soul to him for money. And Sam's here again tonight. Dunno who he's come arter, but he's here now, I tells you all good, said Jenny, as she took up the urn to carry it into the parlor. When she got there, she could scarcely get to the fire. Paul took up the front. His immobility and unconsciousness irritated Jenny beyond silent endurance. I tell you all what, she said, I mean to sign my citation. 'Deed me, I can't kill myself with them as wouldn't even care enough for me to have a mass said for depose of my soul. What do you mean? Asked Paul angrily, for confinement, solitude, bad weather, and anxiety had combined to make him querulous too. I means how if you doesn't even have a kivered way made for the house to the kitchen and back again, I gwine give up waiting on the table. Now, min I tell you, 'deed me, and now if you likes, you may just go and tell Marse Rooster. Marse Rooster? Will you ever give up that horrid nonsense? Why, you old... Is your master a barn door chicken cock that you call him Rooster? Asked the young man snappishly. Well, Shrewster, then, if you wants me to wring my tongue in two, if people's sponsors in baptism will give their children such heathen names, how the devil any Christian woman gwine to twist her tongue round it? I thanks my vine master that my sponsors in baptism name me arter the blessed and holy St. Jane, who has stained and sported me all my days, and ill detect now, though you try to break my poor old heart, along with unkindness at my old ages of life. But what the use of talking? Sam's wasting. And so saying, Jenny gave the finishing touches to the arrangement of the table, and then seized the bell and rang it with rather needless vigor and violence to bring the scattered members of the family together. They came, slowly and singly, and drew round the table more like ghosts than living persons. A few remarks upon the storm, and then they sunk into silence, and as soon as the gloomy meal was over, one by one they dropped away from the room. First went poor Fanny, then Mr. Wilcoxon, and then Miriam. "Where are you going, Miriam?" asked Paul, as the latter was leaving the room. "To my chamber." And before he could further question or longer detain her, she pressed his hand and went out. And Paul, with a deep sigh and a strangely foreboding heart, sank back into his seat. When Miriam reached her bedroom, she carefully closed and locked the door, went to her bureau, opened the top drawer, and took from it a small oblong mahogany glove box. She unlocked the latter, and took out a small parcel, which she unwrapped and laid before her upon the bureau. It was the Xiphias poniard. The weapon had come into her possession some time before in the following manner. During the first winter of Paul Douglas's absence from home, Mr. Wilcoxon had emancipated several of his slaves and provided means for their emigration to Liberia. They were to sail early in March. Among the number was Melchizedek. A few days previous to their departure, this man had come to the house and sought the presence of his youthful mistress. When he knew her to be alone in the parlor, and with a good deal of mystery and hesitation, had laid before her a dagger, which he said he should rather have given to Master Paul, if the latter had been at home. He had picked it up near the water's edge on the sands the night of Miss Mayfield's death, which Master had taken so to heart, that he was afraid to harrow up his feelings by bringing it to him a second time, but that as it was an article of value, he didn't like to take it away with him, and he begged Miss Miriam to take charge of it, and Miriam had taken it, and with surprise, but without the slightest suspicion, had read the name of Thurston Willcoxen carved upon its handle. To all her questions Melchizedek had given evasive answers, or remained obstinately silent, being determined not to betray his master's confidence by revealing his share in the events of that fatal night. Miriam had taken the little instrument, wrapped it carefully in paper, and locked it in her old-fashioned long glove box, and from that day to this she had not opened it. Now, however, she had taken it out with a fixed purpose, and she stood and gazed upon it. Presently she took it up, rolled it in the paper, took her lamp, and slowly left her room, and passed along the passages leading to Mr. Willcoxen's library. The storm howled and raved as she went, and the strong blast, driving through the dilapidated window sashes, nearly extinguished her light before she reached the study door. She blew out the light, and set down the lamp, and rapped at the door. Again and again she rapped, without awakening any response from within. Then she turned the latch, opened the door, and entered. No wonder she had received no answer. The abstracted man before her seemed dead to every sight and sound around him. He sat before the table in the middle of the room, his elbow on the mahogany, his face bowed upon his hand, his haggard countenance revealing a still, speechless despair, as awful as it was profound. Miriam approached and stood by him. Her breath went by his cheek, so near she stood, and yet her presence was unheeded. She stooped to see the object upon which he gazed, the object that now shut out all the world from his sight. It was a long, bright tress of golden auburn hair. Mr. Willcoxen! He did not hear her. How should he hear her low tones when he heard not the cannonading of the storm that shook the house to its foundations? Mr. Willcoxen, she said once more, but he moved not a muscle. Mr. Willcoxen, she repeated, laying her hand upon his arm. He looked up. The expression of haggard despair softened out of his countenance. "Is it you, my dear?" he said. "What has brought you here, Miriam? Were you afraid of the storm? There is no danger, dear child. It has nearly expended its force, and will soon be over. But sit down. Oh no, it's not the storm that has brought me here, though I scarcely remember a storm so violent at this season of the year, except one. This night, 7 years ago, the night that Marian Mayfield was murdered." He started. It is true that he had been thinking of the same dread tragedy, but to hear it suddenly mentioned pierced him like an unexpected sword thrust. Miriam proceeded, speaking in a strange, level monotone, as if unwilling or afraid to trust her voice far. "I came this evening to restore a small but costly article belonging to you, and left in my care some time ago by the boy Melchizedek. It is an antique dagger, somewhat rusty and spotted. Here it is." And she laid the poniard down upon the tress of hair before him. He sprang up as if it had been a viper. His whole frame shook, and the perspiration started from his livid forehead. Miriam, keeping her eye upon him, took the dagger up. "It is very rusty and very much streaked," she said. "I wonder what these dark streaks can be. They run along the edge from the extreme point of the blade upward toward the handle. They look to me like the stains of blood, as if a murderer had stabbed his victim with it, and in his haste to escape had forgotten to wipe the blade, but had left the blood upon it to curdle and corrode the steel. See? Don't it look so to you?" she said, approaching him and holding the weapon up to his view. Girl, what do you mean?" he exclaimed, throwing his hand across his eyes and hurrying across the room. Miriam flung down the weapon with a force that made its metal ring upon the floor, and hastening after him, she stood before him, her dark eyes fixed upon his, streaming with insufferable and consuming fire, that seemed to burn through into his brain. She said, "I have heard of fiends in the human shape. Nay, I have heard of Satan in the guise of an angel of light. Are you such that stand before me now?" "Miriam, what do you mean?" he asked in a sorrowful astonishment. "This is what I mean, that the mystery of Marian Mayfield's fate, the secret of your long remorse, is no longer hidden. I charge you with the murder of Marian Mayfield." "Miriam, you are mad." "Oh, well for me, and better still for you, if I were mad." He was tremendously shaken, more by the vivid memories she recalled than by the astounding charge she made. "In the name of heaven, what leads you to imagine such impossible guilt?" "Good knowledge of the facts, that this month, 8 years ago, in the little Methodist chapel of the Navy Yard in Washington City, you made Marian Mayfield your wife. That this night, 7 years since, in just such a storm as this, on the beach below Pine Bluff, you met and murdered Marian Wilcoxon. And moreover, I assure you that these facts which I tell you now, tomorrow I will lay before a magistrate, together with all the corroborating proof in my possession." "And what proof can you have?" "A gentleman who, unknown and unsuspected, witnessed the private ceremony between yourself and Marian. A packet of French letters written by yourself from Glasgow to Marian in St. Mary's in the spring of 1828. A note found in the pocket of her dress, appointing the fatal meeting on the beach where she perished. 2 physicians who can testify to your unaccountable absence from the deathbed of your parent when you returned late the next morning." "And this," said Thurston, gazing in mournful amazement upon her, "this is the child that I have nourished and brought up in my house? She can believe me guilty of such an atrocious crime? She can aim at my honor and my life such a deadly blow? Alas, alas, it is my duty, it is my fate. I cannot escape it. I have bound my soul by a fearful oath. I cannot evade it. I shall not survive it. Oh, all the heaven is black with doom, and all the earth tainted with blood," cried Miriam wildly. "You are insane, poor girl, you are insane," said Thurston pityingly. "Would heaven I were! Would heaven I were! But I am not. I am not. Too well I remember I have bound my soul by an oath to seek out Marian's destroyer and deliver him up to death, and I must do it. I must do it, though my heart break, as it will break in the act." "And you believe me to be guilty of this awful crime?" "There stands the fearful evidence. Would heaven it did not exist! Oh, would heaven it did not!" "Listen to me, dear Miriam," he said calmly, for he had now recovered his self-possession. "Listen to me. I am perfectly guiltless of this crime you impute to me. How is it possible that I could be otherwise than guiltless? Hear me explain the circumstances that have come to your knowledge." And he attempted to take her hand, to lead her to a seat, but with a slight scream she snatched her hand away, saying wildly, "Touch me not! Your touch thrills me to sickness, to faintness, curdles, turns back the current of blood in my veins. You think this hand a blood-stained one? The evidence! The evidence! I can explain that evidence, Miriam, my child. Sit down, at any distance from me you please, only let it be near enough for you to hear. Did I believe you quite sane, Miriam, grief and anger might possibly seal my lips upon the subject. But believing you partially deranged from illness and other causes, I will defend myself to you. Sit down and hear me." Miriam dropped into the nearest chair. Mr. Wilcoxon took another and commenced. "You have received some truth, Miriam. How it has been presented to you, I will not ask now. I may presently. I was married, as you have somehow ascertained, to Marian Mayfield just before going to Europe. I corresponded with her from Glasgow. I did appoint a meeting with her on the beach upon the fatal evening in question. For what purpose that meeting was appointed it is bootless to tell you, since the meeting never took place. For some hours before, I should have set out to keep my appointment. My grandfather was stricken with apoplexy. I did not wish to leave his bedside until the arrival of the doctor, but when the evening wore on and the storm approached, I grew uneasy upon Marian's account, and sent Melchizedek in the gig to fetch her from the beach to this house, never to leave it. Miriam, the boy, reached the sands only to find her dying. Terrified half out of his senses, he hurried back and told me this story. I forgot my dying relative, forgot everything but that my wife lay wounded and exposed on the beach. I sprung upon horseback and galloped with all possible haste to the spot. By the time I got there, the storm had reached its height, and the beach was completely covered with the boiling waves. My Marian had been carried away. I spent the wretched night in wandering up and down the bluff above the beach and calling on her name. In the morning I returned home to find my grandfather dead, and the family and physicians wondering at my strange absence at such a time. That, Miriam, is the story." Miriam made no comment whatever. Mr. Willcoxen seemed surprised and grieved at her silence. "What have you now to say, Miriam?" "Nothing." "Nothing? What do you think of my explanation?" "I think nothing. My mind is in an agony of doubt and conjecture. I must be governed by stern facts, not by my own prepossessions. I must act upon the evidences in my possession, not upon your explanation of them," said Miriam distractedly, as she arose to leave the room. "And you will denounce me, Miriam? It is my insupportable duty. It is my fate, my doom, for it will kill me. Yet you will do it." "I will." "Yet turn, dear Miriam, look at me once more. Take my hand, since you act from necessity. Do nothing from anger. Turn and take my hand." She turned and stood, such a picture of tearless agony. She met his gentle, compassionate glance. It melted, it subdued her. "Oh, would heaven that I might die rather than do this thing! Would heaven I might die! For my heart turns to you, it turns, and I love you so. Oh, I love you so! Never, never so much as now. My brother, my brother!" And she sunk down and seized his hands and wept over them. "What, Miriam, do you love me, believing me to be guilty? To have been guilty? Not to be guilty? You have suffered remorse? You have repented these many long and wretched years? Oh, surely repentance washes out guilt, and you can now caress and weep over my hands, believing them to have been crimsoned with the life stream of your first and best friend? Yes, 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 yes. Oh, would these tears my very heart sobs forth might wash them pure again. Yes, yes, whether you be guilty or not, my brother, the more I listen to my heart, the more I love you, and I cannot help it. It is because your heart is so much wiser than your head, dear Miriam. Your heart divines the guiltlessness that your reason refuses to credit. Do what you feel that you must, dear Miriam, but in the meantime let us still be brother and sister. Embrace me once more." With anguish bordering on insanity, she threw herself into his arms for a moment, was pressed to his heart, and then breaking away she escaped from the room to her own chamber, and there, with her half-crazed brain and breaking heart, like one acting or forced to act in a ghastly dream, she began to arrange her evidence, collect the letters, the list of witnesses and all, preparatory to setting forth upon her fatal mission in the morning. With the earliest dawn of morning, Miriam left her room. In passing the door of Mr. Willcoxen's chamber, she suddenly stopped. A spasm seized her heart and convulsed her features. She clasped her hands to pray, then, as if there were a wild mockery in the thought, flung them fiercely apart and hurried on her way. She felt that she was leaving the house, never to return. She thought that she should depart without encountering any of its inmates. She was surprised, therefore, to meet Paul in the front passage. He came up and intercepted her. "Where are you going so early, Miriam?" "To Colonel Thornton's." "What, before breakfast?" "Yes." He took both of her hands and looked into her face, her pallid face, with all the color concentrated in a dark crimson spot upon either cheek, with all the life burning deep down in the contracted pupils of the eyes. "Miriam, you are not well. Come, go into the parlor," he said, and attempted to draw her toward the door. "No, Paul, no, I must go out," she said, resisting his efforts. "But why? What is it to you? Let me go." "It is everything to me, Miriam, because I suspect your errand. Come into the parlor. This madness must not go on." "Well, perhaps I am mad, and my words and acts may go for nothing. I hope it may be so. Miriam, I must talk with you, not here, for we're liable to be interrupted every instant. Come into the parlor, at least for a few moments." She no longer resisted that slight plea, but suffered him to lead her in. He gave her a seat and took one beside her, and took her hand in his and began to urge her to give up her fatal purpose. He appealed to her through reason, through religion, through all the strongest passions and affectations of her soul, through her devotion to her guardian, through the gratitude she owed him, through their mutual love that must be sacrificed if her insane purpose should be carried out. To all of this she answered, "I think of nothing concerning myself, Paul. I think only of him. There is the anguish. You are insane, Miriam, yet crazy as you are, you may do a great deal of harm, much to Thurston, but much more to yourself. It is not probable that the evidence you think that you have will be considered by any magistrate of sufficient importance to be acted upon against a man of Mr. Willcoxen's life and character. Heaven grant that such may be the case. Attend. Collect your thoughts. The evidence you produce will probably be considered unimportant and quite unworthy of attention. But what will be thought of you who volunteer to offer it? I had not reflected upon that, and now that you mention it, I do not care. And if, on the other hand, the testimony which you have to offer be considered ground for indictment, and Thurston is brought to trial and acquitted, as he surely would be, aye, heaven send it, and the whole affair blown all over the country, how would you appear? I know not, and care not. So he is cleared. Heaven grant I may be the only sufferer. I am willing to take the infamy. You would be held up before the world as an ingrate, a domestic traitress, and unnatural monster. You would be hated by all. Your name and history become a tradition of almost impossible wickedness. Why, do you think that in such an hour as this I care for myself? No, 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 no. Heaven grant that it may be as you say, that my brother be acquitted, and I only may suffer. I am willing to suffer shame and death for him whom I denounce. Let me go, Paul. I have lost too much time here. Will nothing induce you to abandon this wicked purpose? Nothing on earth, Paul. Nothing? No. So help me heaven, give way. Let me go, Paul. You must not go, Miriam. I must and will, and that directly. Stand aside. Then you shall not go. Shall not? I said shall not. Who will prevent me? I will. You are a maniac, Miriam, and must be restrained from going abroad and setting the county in a conflagration. You will have to guard me very close for the whole of my life then. At that moment the door was quietly opened, and Mr. Willcoxen entered. Miriam's countenance changed fearfully, but she wrung her hand from the clasp of Paul's and hastened toward the door. Paul sprang forward and intercepted her. "What does this mean?" asked Mr. Willcoxen, stepping up to them. "It means that she is mad and will do herself or somebody else much mischief," cried Paul sharply. "For shame, Paul! Release her instantly," said Thurston authoritatively. "Would you release a lunatic bent upon setting the house on fire?" expostulated the young man, still holding her. "She is no lunatic. Let her go instantly, sir." Paul, with a groan, complied. Miriam hastened onward, cast one look of anguish back to Thurston's face, rushed back, and threw herself upon her knees at his feet, clasped his hands, and cried, "I do not ask you to pardon me. I dare not. But God deliver you, if it brand me and my accusation with infamy, and God forever bless you." Then rising, she fled from the room. The brothers looked at each other. "Thurston, do you know where she's gone?" what she intends to do? Yes. You do? Assuredly. And you would not prevent her? Most certainly not. Paul was gazing into his brother's eyes, and as he gazed, every vestige of doubt and suspicion vanished from his mind. It was like the sudden clearing up of the sky and shining forth of the sun. He grasped his brother's hands with cordial joy. God bless you, Thurston. I echo her prayer. God forever bless you. But Thurston, would it not have been wiser to prevent her going out? How? Would you have used force with Miriam? Restrained her personal liberty? Yes, I would have done so. That would have been not only wrong, but useless. For if her strong affections for us were powerless to restrain her, be sure that physical means would fail. She would make herself heard in some way, and thus make our cause much worse. Besides, I should loathe for myself to resort to any such expedients. But she may do much harm, and you? I am prepared to meet what comes. Strange infatuation, that she should believe you to be. I will not wrong you by finishing that sentence. She does not at heart believe me guilty. Her mind is in a storm. She is bound by her oath to act upon the evidence rather than upon her own feelings, and that evidence is much stronger against me, Paul, than you have any idea of. Come into my study, and I will tell you the whole story. And Paul followed him thither. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Missing Bride. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. Southworth, Chapter 34. Upon charge of murder. Some hours later in that day, Colonel Thornton was sitting in his capacity of police magistrate in his office at the court. The room was occupied by about a dozen persons, men and women, black and white. He had just got through with one or two petty cases of debt or theft, and had up before him a poor, half-starved white herring, charged with sheep-stealing, when the door opened, and a young girl, closely veiled, entered and took a seat in the farthest corner from the crowd. The case of the poor man was soon disposed of. The evidence was not positive. The compassionate magistrate leaned to the side of mercy, and the man was discharged and went home, most probably to dine upon mutton. This being the last case, the magistrate arose and ordered the room to be cleared of all who had no further business with him. When the loungers had left the police office, the young girl came forward, stood before the magistrate, and raised her veil, revealing the features of Miriam. "Good morning, Miss Shields," said Colonel Thornton, and neither the countenance nor manner of this suave and stately gentleman of the old school revealed the astonishment he really felt on seeing the young lady in such a place. He arose and courteously placed her in a chair, reseated himself, and turned toward her and respectfully awaited her communication. "Colonel Thornton, you remember Miss Mayfield and the manner of her death that made some stir here about 7 years ago?" The face of the old gentleman suddenly grew darkened and slightly convulsed, as the face of the sea when clouds and wind pass over it. "Yes, young lady, I remember. I have come to denounce her murderer." Colonel Thornton took up his pen and drew toward him a blank form of a writ, and sat looking toward her and waiting for her further words. Her bosom heaved, her face worked, her voice was choked and unnatural as she said, "You will please to issue a warrant for the arrest of Thurston Willcoxen." Colonel Thornton laid down his pen, arose from his seat, and took her hand and gazed upon her with an expression of blended surprise and compassion. "My dear young lady, you're not very well. May I inquire, are your friends in town, or are you here alone?" "I am here alone. Nay, I am not mad, Colonel Thornton, although your looks betray that you think me so." "No, no, not mad, only indisposed," said the colonel, in no degree modifying his opinion. "Colonel Thornton, if there is anything strange and eccentric in my looks and manner, you must set it down to the strangeness of the position in which I am placed. My dear young lady, Miss Thornton is at the hotel to-day. Will you permit me to take you to her? You will do as you please, Colonel Thornton, after you shall have heard my testimony, and examine the proofs I have to lay before you. Then I shall permit you to judge of my soundness of mind as you will, premising, however, that my sanity or insanity can have no possible effect upon the proofs that I submit," she said, laying a packet upon the table between them. Something in her manner now compelled the magistrate to give her words an attention for which he blamed himself as for a gross wrong toward his favourite clergyman. "Do I understand you to charge Mr. Willcoxen with the death of Miss Mayfield?" "Yes," said Miriam, bowing her head. "What cause, young lady, can you possibly have for making such a monstrous and astounding accusation?" "I came here for the purpose of telling you, if you will permit me. Nor do I, since you doubt my reason, ask you to believe my statement, unsupported by proof. Go on, young lady, I am all attention. Will you administer the usual oath?" "No, Miss Shields, I will hear your story first, in the capacity of a friend." "And you think that the only capacity in which you will be called upon to act? Well, may Heaven grant it," said Miriam, and she began and told him all the facts that had recently come to her knowledge, ending by placing the packet of letters in his hands. While she spoke, Colonel Thornton's pen was busy making minutes of her statements. When she had concluded, he laid down the pen, and turning to her, asked, "You believe, then, that Mr. Willcoxen committed this murder?" "I know not. I act only upon the evidence, circumstantial evidence, often as delusive as it is fatal. Do you think it possible that Mr. Willcoxen could have meditated such a crime?" No, never meditated. If he committed it, it was unpremeditated, unintentional, the accident of some lover's quarrel, some frenzy of passion, jealousy, I know not what. Let me ask you, then, why you volunteer to prosecute?" "Because I must do so. But tell me, do you think what I have advanced trivial and unimportant?" asked Miriam in a hopeful tone, for little she thought of herself, if only her obligation were discharged and her brother still unharmed. "On the contrary, I think it so important as to constrain my instant attention and oblige me to issue a warrant for the apprehension of Mr. Thurston Willcoxen," said Colonel Thornton, as he wrote rapidly, filling out several blank documents. Then he rang a bell that was answered by the entrance of several police officers. To the first he gave a warrant, saying, "You will serve this immediately upon Mr. Willcoxen," and to another he gave some half-dozen subpoenas, saying, "You will serve all these between this time and 12 tomorrow." When these functionaries were all discharged, Miriam arose and went to the magistrate. "What do you think of the testimony?" "It is more than sufficient to commit Mr. Willcoxen for trial. It may cost him his life." A sudden paleness passed over her face. She turned to leave the office, but the hand of death seemed to clutch her heart, arresting its pulsations, stopping the current of her blood, smothering her breath, and she fell to the floor. Wearily passed the day at Dell Delight. Thurston, as usual, sitting reading or writing at his library table. Paul rambling uneasily about the house, now taking up a book and attempting to read, now throwing it down in disgust, sometimes almost irresistibly impelled to spring upon his horse and gallop to Charlotte Hall, then restraining his strong impulse lest something important should transpire at home during his absence. So passed the day until the middle of the afternoon. Paul was walking up and down the long piazza, indifferent for the first time in his life to the loveliness of the soft April atmosphere that seemed to blend, raise, and idealize the features of the landscape until earth, water, and sky were harmonized into celestial beauty. Paul was growing very anxious for the reappearance of Miriam, or for some news of her or her errand, yet dreading every moment an arrival of another sort. Where could the distracted girl be? Would her report be received and acted upon by the magistrate? If so, what would be done? How would it all end? Would Thurston sleep in his own house or in a prison that night? When would Miriam return? Would she ever return after having assumed such a task as she had taken upon herself? These and other questions presented themselves every moment as he walked up and down the piazza, keeping an eye upon the distant road. Presently a cloud of dust in the distance arrested both his attention and his promenade, and brought his anxiety to a crisis. He soon perceived a single horseman galloping rapidly down the road, and never removed his eyes until the horseman turned into the gate and galloped swiftly up to the house. Then, with joy, Paul recognized the rider, and ran eagerly down the stairs to give him welcome, and reached the paved walk just as Cloudy drew rein and threw himself from the saddle. The meeting was a cordial, joyous one. With Cloudy it was sincere, unmixed joy. With Paul it was only a pleasant surprise and a transient forgetfulness. Rapid questions were asked and answered as they hurried into the house. Cloudy's ship had been ordered home sooner than had been expected. He had reached Norfolk a week before. By that afternoon had immediately procured a horse and hurried on home. Hence his unlooked-for arrival. How is Thurston? How is Miriam? How are they all at Luckenough? All are well. The family at Luckenough are absent in the south, but are expected home every week. And where is Miriam? At the village. And Thurston? In his library, as usual, said Paul, and touched the bell to summon a messenger to send to Mr. Wilcoxon. Have you dined, Cloudy? Yes. No, I ate some bread and cheese in the village. Don't fuss. I'd rather wait till supper time. The door opened, and Mr. Wilcoxon entered. Whatever secret anxiety might have weighed upon the minister's heart, no sign of it was suffered to appear upon his countenance as, smiling cordially, he came in, holding out his hand to welcome his cousin and early playmate, expressing equal surprise and pleasure at seeing him. Cloudy had to go over the ground of explanation of his sudden arrival, and by the time he had finished, old Jenny came in, laughing and wriggling with joy to see him. But Jenny didn't remain long in the parlor. She hurried out into the kitchen to express her feelings professionally by preparing a welcome feast. And you're not married yet, Thurston? As great a favorite as you are with the ladies? How is that? Every time I come home, I expect to be presented to a Mrs. Wilcoxon, and never am gratified. Why is that? Perhaps I believe in the celibacy of the clergy. Perhaps you've never recovered from the disappointment of losing Miss Leroy. Ah, Cloudy, people who live in glass houses should not throw stones. I suspect you judge me by yourself. How is it with you, Cloudy? Has no fair maiden been able to teach you to forget your boy love for Jacquelina? Cloudy winced, but tried to cover his embarrassment with a laugh. Oh, I've been in love 40 dozen times. I'm always in love. My heart is continually going through a circle from one fit to another, like the sun through the signs of the zodiac, only it never comes to anything. Well, at least little Jacko is forgotten, which is one congratulatory circumstance. No, she's not forgotten. I will not wrong her by saying that she is, or could be. All other loves are merely the foreign ports, which my heart visits transiently now and then. Lena is its native home. I don't know how it is with most cases of disappointment such as yours with Miss Leroy. I suppose the regret may be short-lived enough, but when an affection has been part and parcel of one's being from infancy up, why, it's in one's soul and heart and blood, so to speak, is identical with one's consciousness and inseparable from one's life. Do you ever see her? See her? Yes, but how? At each return from a voyage I may see her once, with an iron grating between us, she disguised with her black shrouding robe and veil, and thinking that she must suffer here to expiate the fate of Dr. Grimshaw, who, scorpion-like, stung himself to death with the venom of his own bad passions. She is a sister of mercy, devoted to good works, and leaves her convent only in times of war, plague, pestilence, or famine to minister to the suffering. She nursed me through the yellow fever when I lay in the hospital at New Orleans, but when I got well enough to recognize her, she vanished, evaporated, made herself thin air, and another sister served in her place. Have you ever seen her since?" "Yes, once. I sought out her convent, and went with a fixed determination to reason with her, and to persuade her not to renew her vows for another year. You know the sisters only take vows for a year at a time." "Did you make any impression on her mind?" inquired Thurston, with more interest than he had yet shown in any part of the story. "Make any impression on her mind? No, I didn't even attempt to. How could I, when I only saw her behind a grate, with the prioress on one side of her, and the portress on the other? My visit was silent enough, and short enough, and sad enough. Why can't she come out of that? What have I done to deserve to be made miserable? I don't deserve it. I am the most ill-used man in the United States service." While Cloudy spoke, old Jenny was hurrying in and out between the house and the kitchen, and busying herself with setting the table, laying the cloth, and arranging the service. But presently she came in, throwing wide the door, and announcing, "Two gentlemen axin' to see master." Thurston arose and turned to confront them, while Paul became suddenly pale on recognizing two police officers. "Good afternoon, Mr. Willcoxen." "Good afternoon, gentlemen," said the foremost and most respectable looking of the two, lifting his hat and bowing to the fireside party. Then replacing it, he said, "Mr. Willcoxen, will you be kind enough to step this way and give me your attention, sir?" He walked to the window, and Thurston followed him. Paul stood with a pale face and firmly compressed lip, and gazed after them. And Cloudy, unsuspicious Cloudy, arose and stood with his back to the fire, and whistled a sea air. "Mr. Willcoxen, you can see for yourself the import of this paper," said the officer, handing the warrant. Thurston read it and returned it. "Mr. Willcoxen," added the policeman, "myself and my comrade came hither on horseback. Let me suggest to you to order your carriage. One of us will accompany you in the drive, and all remarks will be avoided." "I thank you for the hint, Mr. Jenkins. I had, however, intended to do as you advise," said Thurston, beckoning his brother to approach. "Paul, I am a prisoner. Say nothing at present to Cloudy. Permit him to assume that business takes me away, and go now quietly and order horses put to the carriage. Dr. Douglas, we shall want your company also," said the officer, serving Paul with the subpoena. Paul ground his teeth together and rushed out the door. "Keep an eye on that young man," said the policeman to his comrade, and the latter followed Paul into the yard and on to the stables. The haste and passion of Paul's manner had attracted Cloudy's attention, and now he stood looking on with surprise and inquiry. "Cloudy," said Thurston, approaching him, "a most pressing affair demands my presence at court this afternoon. Paul must also attend me. I may not return tonight. Paul, however, certainly will. In the meantime, Cloudy, my boy, make yourself as much at home and as happy as you possibly can. Oh, don't mind me. Never make a stranger of me. Go by all means. I wouldn't detain you for the world. Hope it's nothing of a painful nature that calls you from home, however. Any parishioner ill, dying, and wanting your ghostly consolations?" "Oh, no," said Thurston, smiling. "Glad of it. Go by all means. I'll make myself jolly until you return," said Cloudy, walking up and down the floor, whistling a love ditty and thinking of little Jacko. He always thought of her with tenfold intensity whenever he returned home and came into her neighborhood. "Mr. Jenkins, will you follow me to my library?" said Thurston. The officer bowed assent, and Mr. Willcoxen proceeded thither for the purpose of securing his valuable papers and locking his secretary and writing desk. After an absence of some 15 minutes, they returned to the parlor to find Paul and the constable awaiting them. "Is the carriage ready?" asked Mr. Willcoxen. "Yes, sir," replied the constable. "Then I believe we also are. Is it not so?" The police officer bowed, and Mr. Willcoxen walked up to Cloudy and held out his hand. "Good-bye, Cloudy, for the present. Paul will probably be home by nightfall, even if I should be detained. "Oh, don't hurry yourself upon my account. I shall do very well. Jenny can take care of me," said Cloudy jovially, as he shook the offered hand of Thurston. Paul could not trust himself to look Cloudy in the face and say good-bye. He averted his head, and so followed Mr. Willcoxen and the officer into the yard. Mr. Willcoxen, the senior officer, and Paul Douglas entered the carriage, and the second constable attended on horseback, and so the party set out for Charlotte Hall. Hour after hour passed. Old Jenny came in and put the supper on the table, and stood presiding over the urn and teapot while Cloudy ate his supper. Old Jenny's tongue ran as if she felt obliged to make up in conversation for the absence of the rest of the family. "Lord knows I's glad 'nough to see you come back," she said. "Dis yer place bad 'nough. Sam's been wastin' here eber since the family come back from de city. Dey must 'a fetch him 'long of dem. Now I do suppose somethin' is happening 'long o' Miss Miriam, as she went hayin' off to de village to morning before she got her breakfast. Nobody on y'earth could tell what fur. Now de other two is gone, and nobody left here to mind de house, 'cept as you and me. Sam's wastin'." Cloudy laughed and tried to cheer her spirits by a gay reply, and then they kept up between them a lively badinage of repartee, in which old Jenny acquitted herself quite as wittily as her young master. And after supper she cleared away the service, and went to prepare a bed and light a fire in the room appropriated to Cloudy. And so the evening wore away. It grew late, yet neither Thurston nor Paul appeared. Cloudy began to think their return unseasonably delayed, and at 11 o'clock he took up his lamp to retire to his chamber, when he was startled and arrested by the barking of dogs and by the rolling of the carriage into the yard, and in a few minutes the door was thrown violently open, and Paul Douglas, pale, haggard, convulsed, and despairing, burst suddenly into the room. "Paul! Paul! What in the name of heaven has happened?" cried Cloudy, starting up, surprised and alarmed by his appearance. "Oh, it has ended in his committal. It has ended in his committal. He is fully committed for trial. He was sent off tonight to the county jail at Leonardtown in the custody of 2 officers." "Who is committed? What are you talking about, Paul?" said Cloudy, taking his hand kindly and looking in his face. These words and actions brought Paul somewhat to his senses. "Oh, you do not know. You do not even guess anything about it, Cloudy. Oh, it's a terrible misfortune. Let me sit down, and I will tell you." And Paul Douglas threw himself into a chair, and in an agitated, nearly incoherent manner, related the circumstances that led to the arrest of Thurston Willcoxen for the murder of Marian Mayfield. When he had concluded the strange story, Cloudy started up, took his hat, and was about to leave the room. "Where are you going, Cloudy?" "To the stables to saddle my horse, to ride to Leonardtown this night. It's nearly 12 o'clock." "I know it, but by hard riding I can reach Leonardtown by morning, and be with Thurston as soon as the prison doors are opened. And I will ask you, Paul, to be kind enough to forward my trunks from the tavern at Benedict to Leonardtown, where I shall remain to be near Thurston as long as he needs my services." "God bless you, Cloudy. I myself wish to accompany him, but he would not for a moment hear of my doing so. He entreated me to return hither to take care of poor Fanny and the homestead." Cloudy scarcely waited to hear this benediction, but hurried to the stables, found and saddled his horse, threw himself into the stirrups, and in 5 minutes was dashing rapidly through the thick, low-lying forest, stretching inland from the coast. 8 hours of hard riding brought him to the county seat. Just stopping long enough to have his horse put up at the best hotel and to inquire his way to the prison, he hurried thither. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and the street corners were thronged with loungers, conversing in low, eager tones upon the present all-absorbing topic of discourse, the astounding event of the arrest of the great preacher, the Reverend Thurston Willcoxen, upon the charge of murder. Hurrying past all these, Cloudy reached the jail. He readily gained admittance, and was conducted to the cell of the prisoner. He found Thurston attired as when he left home, sitting at a small wooden stand, and calmly occupied with his pen. He arose and smilingly extended his hand, saying, "This is very kind, as well as very prompt, Cloudy. You must have ridden fast." "I did. Leave us alone, if you please, my friend," said Cloudy, turning to the jailer. The latter went out and locked the door upon the friends. "This seems a sad event to greet you on your return home, Cloudy, but never mind, it will all be well." "Sad? It's a farce. I have not an instant's misgiving about the result, but the present indignity. Oh, I could be calm, my dear Cloudy. Have you heard anything of the circumstances that led to this?" "Yes, Paul told me, but he's as crazy and incoherent as a bedlamite. I want you, if you please, Thurston, if you have no objection, to go over the whole story for me, that I may see if I can make anything of it for your defense. Poor Paul, he takes this matter far too deeply to heart. Sit down. I have not a second chair to offer, but take this or the foot of the cot, as you prefer." Cloudy took the foot of the cot. "Certainly, Cloudy, I will tell you everything," said Thurston, and forthwith commenced his explanation. Thurston's narrative was clear and to the point. When it was finished, Cloudy asked a number of questions, chiefly referring to the day of the tragedy. When these were answered, he sat with his brows gathered down in astute thought. Presently he asked, "Thurston, have you engaged counsel?" "Yes, Mr. Rumford has been with me this morning." "Is he fully competent?" "The best lawyer in the state." "When does the court sit?" "On Monday week." "Have you any idea whether your trial will come on early in the session?" "I presume it will come on very soon. As Mr. Rumford informs me, there are but few cases on the docket." "Thank heaven for that, as your confinement here promises to be of very short duration. However, the limited time makes it the more necessary for me to act with a greater promptitude. I came here with the full intention of remaining in town as long as you should be detained in this infernal place, but I shall have to leave you within the hour." "Of course, Cloudy, my dear boy, I could not expect you to restrict yourself to this town so soon after escaping from the confinement of your ship. Oh, you don't understand me at all. Do you think I'm going away on my own business or amusement while you're here? To the devil with that thought. Begging your reverence's pardon, no, I'm going in search of Jacquelina. Since hearing your explanation, particularly that part of it relating to your visit to Luckenough upon the morning of the day of Marian's death, and the various scenes that occurred there, certain vague ideas of my own have taken form and color, and I feel convinced that Jacquelina could throw some light upon this affair." "Indeed? Why should you think so?" "Oh, from many small indexes which I have neither the time nor inclination to tell you. For, taken apart from collateral circumstances and associations, they would appear visionary. Each in itself is really trivial enough, but in the mass they are very indicative. At least I think so, and I must seek Jacquelina out immediately. And to do so, Thurston, I must leave you this moment, for there is a boat to leave the wharf for Baltimore this morning, if it has not already gone. It will take me 2 days to reach Baltimore, and another day to get to her convent, and it will altogether be 5 or 6 days before I can get back here. Good-bye, Thurston. Heaven keep you, and give you a speedy deliverance from this black hole." And Cloudy threw his arms around Thurston in a brotherly embrace, and then knocked at the door to be let out. In half an hour Cloudy was once more upon the waters, in full sail for Baltimore. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Missing Bride. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. Southworth. Chapter 35. Marian. Great was the consternation caused by the arrest of a gentleman so high in social rank and scholastic and theological reputation as the Reverend Thurston Willcoxen, and upon a charge, too, so awful as that for which he stood committed. It was the one all-absorbing subject of thought and conversation. People neglected their business, forgetting to work, to bargain, buy or sell, Village shopkeepers, instead of vamping their wares, leaned eagerly over their counters, and with great dilated eyes and dogmatical forefingers discussed with customers the merits or demerits of the great case. Village mechanics, occupied solely with the subject of the pastor's guilt or innocence, disappointed with impunity customers who were themselves too deeply interested and too highly excited by the same subject to remember, far less to rebuke them for unfulfilled engagements. Even women totally neglected or badly fulfilled their domestic avocations, for who in the parish could sit down quietly to the construction of a garment or a pudding while their beloved pastor, the all-praised Thurston Willcoxen, lay in prison awaiting his trial for a capital crime? As usual in such cases, there was very little cool reasoning and very much passionate declamation. The first astonishment had given place to conjecture, which yielded in turn to dogmatic judgments, acquiescing or condemning as the self-constituted judges happened to be favorable or adverse to the cause of the minister. When the first Sabbath after the arrest came, and the church was closed because the pulpit was unoccupied, the dispersed congregation, haunted by the vision of the absent pastor in his cell, discussed the matter anew, and differed and disputed and fell out worse than ever. Parties formed for and against the minister, and party feuds raged high. Upon the second Sabbath, being the day before the county court should sit, a substitute filled the pulpit for Mr. Willcoxen, and his congregation reassembled to hear an edifying discourse from the text, "I myself have seen the ungodly in great power, and flourishing like a green bay tree. I went by, and lo, he was gone. I sought him, but his place was nowhere to be found." This sermon bore rather hard, by pointed allusions, upon the great elevation and sudden downfall of the celebrated minister, and in consequence delighted one portion of the audience and enraged the other. The last mentioned charged the new preacher with envy, hatred, and malice, and all uncharitableness, besides the wish to rise on the ruin of his unfortunate predecessor, and they went home in high indignation, resolved not to set foot within the parish church again until the honorable acquittal of their own beloved pastor should put all his enemies, persecutors, and slanderers to shame. The excitement spread and gained force and fire with space. The press took it up and went to war as the people had done, and as far as the name of Thurston Willcoxen had been wafted by the breath of fame, it was now blown by the blatant beast, aye, and farther too, for those who had never even heard of his great talents, his learning, his eloquence, his zeal, and his charity, were made familiar with his imputed crime, and shuddered while they denounced. And this was natural and well, so far as it went to prove that great excellence is so much less rare than great evil, as to excite less attention. The news of this signal event spread like wildfire all over the country, from Maine to Louisiana, and from Missouri to Florida, producing everywhere great excitement, but falling in three places with the crushing force of a thunderbolt. First, by Marian's fireside. In a private parlor of a quiet hotel in one of the eastern cities sat the lady, now nearly 30 years of age, yet still in the bloom of her womanly beauty. She had lately arrived from Europe, charged with one of those benevolent missions which it was the business and the consolation of her life to fulfill. It was late in the afternoon, and the low descending sun threw its golden gleam across the round table at which she sat, busily engaged with reading reports, making notes, and writing letters connected with the affair upon which she had come. 7 years had not changed Marian much. A little less vivid, perhaps, the bloom on cheeks and lips a shade paler, the angel brow a shade darker, the rich and lustrous auburn tresses softer and calmer, fuller of thought and love, the clear blue eyes, sweeter her tones, and gentler all her motions. That was all. Her dress was insignificant in material, make, and color, yet the wearer unconsciously imparted a classic and regal grace to every fold and fall of the drapery. No splendor of apparel could have given such effect to her individual beauty as this quiet costume. I would I were an artist, that I might reproduce her image as she was. The glorious face and head, the queenly form in its plain but graceful robe of I know not what, grey serge perhaps. Her whole presence, her countenance, manner, and tone revealed the richness, strength, and serenity of a faithful, loving, self-denying, God-reliant soul, of one who could recall the past, endure the present, and anticipate the future without regret, complaint, or fear. Sometimes the lady's soft eyes would lift themselves from her work to rest with tenderness upon the form of a little child, so small and still that you would not have noticed her presence but in following the lady's loving glance. She sat in a tiny rocking chair, nursing a little white rabbit on her lap. She was not a beautiful child. She was too diminutive and pale, with hazy blue eyes and faded yellow hair, and yet her little face was so demure and sweet, so meek and loving, that it would haunt and soften you more than that of a beautiful child could. The child had been orphaned from birth, and when but a few days old, had been received into the children's home. Marian never had a favorite among her children, but this little waif was so completely orphaned, so desolate and destitute, and withal so puny, fragile, and lifeless, that Marian took her to her own heart day and night, imparting from her own fine vital temperament the warmth and vigor that nourished the perishing little human blossom to life and health. If ever a mother's heart lived in a maiden's bosom, it was in Marian's. As she had cherished Miriam, she now cherished Angel, and she was as fondly loved by the one as she had been by the other. And so for 5 years past, Angel had been Marian's inseparable companion. She sat with her little lesson, or her sewing, or her pet rabbit, at Marian's feet while she worked, held her hand when she walked out, sat by her side at the table or in the carriage, and slept nestled in her arms at night. She was the one earthly blossom that bloomed in Marian's solitary path. Angel now sat with her rabbit on her knee, waiting demurely till Marian should have time to notice her. And the lady still worked on, stopping once in a while to smile upon the child. There was a file of the evening papers lying near at hand upon the table where she wrote, but Marian had not yet had time to look at them. Soon, however, she had occasion to refer to one of them for the names of the members of the Committee on Public Lands. In casting her eyes over the paper, her glance suddenly lighted upon a paragraph that sent all the blood from her cheeks to her heart. She dropped the paper, sank back in her chair, and covered her blanched face with both hands, and strove for self-control. Angel softly put down the rabbit, and gently stole to her side, and looked up with her little face full of wondering sympathy. Presently Marian began passing her hands slowly over her forehead with a sort of unconscious self-mesmerism, and then she dropped them wearily upon her lap, and Angel saw how pallid was her face, how ashen and tremulous her lip, how quivering her hands. But after a few seconds Marian stooped and picked the paper up and read the long, wonder-mongering affair, in which all that had been and all that had seemed, as well as many things could neither be nor seem, were related at length, or conjectured, or suggested. It began by announcing the arrest of the Reverend Thurston Willcoxen upon the charge of murder, and then went back to the beginning and related the whole story, from the first disappearance of Marian Mayfield to the late discoveries that had led to the apprehension of the supposed murderer, with many additions and improvements gathered in the rolling of the ball of falsehood. Among the rest, that the body of the unhappy young lady had been washed ashore several miles below the scene of her dreadful fate, and had been charitably interred by some poor fisherman. The article concluded by describing the calm demeanor of the accused and the contemptuous manner in which he treated a charge so grave, scorning even to deny it. Oh, I do not wonder at the horror and consternation this matter has caused. When the deed was attempted, more than the intended death wound didn't overcome me, and nothing in the universe but the evidence of my own senses could have convinced me of his purposed guilt. And still I cannot realize it. He must have been insane. But he treats the discovery of his intended and supposed crime with scorn and contempt. Alas, alas, is this the end of years of suffering and probation? Is this the fruit of that long remorse from which I had hoped so much for his redemption, a remorse without repentance and barren of reformation? And yet I must save him. She arose and rang the bell, and gave orders to have 2 seats secured for her in the coach that would leave in the morning for Baltimore. And then she began to walk up and down the floor to try and walk off the excitement that was fast gaining upon her. Before this night and this discovery, not for the world would Marian have made her existence known to him. Far less would she have sought his presence. Nay, deeming such a meeting improper, as it was impossible, her mind had never contemplated it for an instant. She had watched his course, sent anonymous donations to his charities, hoped much from his repentance and good works, but never hoped in any regard to herself. But now it was absolutely necessary that she should make her existence known to him. She would go to him. She must save him. She should see him and speak to him whom she had never hoped to meet again in life. She would see him again in 3 days. The thought was too exciting even for her strong heart and frame and calm, self-governing nature. And in defiance of reason and of will, her long-buried youthful love, her pure, earnest, single-hearted love, burst its secret sepulchre, and rejoiced through all her nature. The darkness of the past was, for the time, forgotten. Memory recalled no picture of unkindness, injustice, or inconstancy. Even the scene upon the beach was faded, gone, lost. But the light of the past glowed around her, their seaside strolls and woodland wanderings, the still green places where they met, the moonlit branches dewy wet, the greeting and the parting word, the smile, the embrace, the tone that made an Eden of the forest shade, kindling a pure rapture from memory and a wild longing from hope that her full heart could scarce contain. But soon came on another current of thought and feeling, opposed to the first. Doubt and fear of the meeting. For herself, she felt that she could forget all the sorrows of the past, aye, and with fervent glowing soul, and flushed cheeks, and tearful eyes, and clasped hands, she adored the Father in heaven, that he had put no limit to forgiveness. No. In that blessed path of light, all space was open to the human will, and the heart might forgive infinitely, and to its own measureless extent. But how would Thurston meet her? He had suffered such tortures from remorse that doubtless he would rejoice with exceeding great joy to find that the deed attempted in some fit of madness had really not been effected. But his sufferings had sprung from remorse of conscience, not from remorse of love. No, except as his deliverer, he would probably not be pleased to see her. As soon as this thought had seized her mind, then indeed all the bitterest scenes in the past started up to life, and broke down the defenses reared by love and faith and hope, and let in the tide of anguish and despair that rolled over her soul, shaking it as if it had not been shaken for many years. And her head fell upon her bosom, and her hands were clasped convulsively as she walked up and down the floor, striving with herself, striving to subdue the rebel passions of her heart, striving to attain her wonted calmness and strength and self-possession, and at last praying earnestly, "O Father, The rains descend, and the floods come, and the winds blow and beat upon my soul. Let not its strength fall, as if built upon the sand. And so she walked up and down, striving and praying, nor was the struggle in vain. Once more she conquered a peace in her own bosom. She turned her eyes upon little Angel. The infant was drooping over one arm of her rocking chair like a fading lily, but her soft hazy eyes, full of vague sympathy, followed the lady wherever she went. Marian's heart smote her for her temporary forgetfulness of the child's wants. It was now twilight, and Marian rang for lights and Angel's milk and bread, which was soon brought. And then, with her usual quiet tenderness, she undressed the little one, heard her prayers, took her up, and as she rocked, sang a sweet, low evening hymn that soothed the child to sleep, and her own heart to perfect rest. And early the next morning, Marian and little Angel set out by the first coach for Baltimore, on their way to St. Mary's County. The convent of Bethlehem was not only the sanctuary of professed nuns, the school for girls, the nursery of orphans, but it was also the temporary home of those sisters of mercy who go forth into the world only on errands of Christian love and charity, and return to their convent often only to die, worn out by toil among scenes and sufferers near which few but themselves would venture. And as they pass hence to heaven, their ranks are still filled up from the world, not always by the weary and disappointed. Often young Catholic girls voluntarily leave the untried world that is smiling fair before them, to enter upon a life of poverty, self-denial, and merciful ministrations. So even in this century, the order of the Sisters of Mercy is kept up. Among the most active and zealous of the order of Bethlehem was the Sister Theresa, the youngest of the band. Youthful as she was, however, this sister's heart was no sweet sacrifice, a flower offered in the bud. On the contrary, I am afraid that Sister Theresa had trifled with and pinched and bruised and trampled the poor budding heart until she thought it good for nothing upon earth before she offered it to heaven. I fear it was nothing higher than that strange revulsion of feeling, world weariness, disappointment, disgust, remorse, fanaticism, either any or all of these things, call it what you will, that in past ages and Catholic countries have filled monasteries with the whilom gay, worldly, and ambitious, that has sent many a woman in the prime of her beauty, and many a man at the acme of his power, into a convent, that transformed the mighty Emperor Charles V into a cowled and shrouded monk, the reckless swashbuckler Ignatius Loyola into a holy saint, and the beautiful Louisa de la Valliere into an ascetic nun, which finally metamorphosed the gayest, maddest, merriest elf that ever danced in the moonlight into Sister Theresa. Poor Jacquelina! For of course you can have no doubt that it is of her we are speaking. She perpetrated her last lugubrious joke on the day that she was to have made her vows. For when asked what patron saint she would select by taking that saint's name in religion, she answered Saint Theresa, because Saint Theresa would understand her case the best, having been like herself a scamp and a rattle-brain before she took it into her head to astonish her friends by becoming a saint. Poor Jacko said this with the solemnest face and the most serious earnestness, but with such a reputation as she had had for pertness, of course nobody would believe but that she was making fun of the blessed Theresa, and so she was put upon further probation with the injunction to say the 7 penitential psalms 7 times a day until she was in a holier frame of mind, which she did, though under protest that she didn't think the words composed by David to express his remorse for his own enormous sin exactly suited her case. Sister Theresa, if the least steady and devout, was certainly the most active and zealous and courageous among them all. She yawned horribly over the long litanies and long sermons, but if ever there was a work of mercy, requiring extraordinary labor, privation, exposure, and danger, Sister Theresa was the one to face in the cause. Lightning and tempest, plague, pestilence, and famine, battle and murder, and sudden death. Happy was she, or content? No. She was moody, hysterical, and devotional by turns. Sometimes a zeal for good works would possess her, sometimes the old fun and quaintness would break out, and sometimes an overwhelming fit of remorse, each depending upon the accidental cause that would chance to arouse the moods. Humane creatures are like climates, some of a temperate atmosphere, taking even lifelong sorrow serenely, never forgetting and never exaggerating its cause, never very wretched, if never quite happy. Others of a more torrid nature have long sunny seasons of bird-like cheerfulness and happy forgetfulness, until some slight cause, striking the electric chain wherewith we are darkly bound, shall startle up memory, and grief intensely realized shall rise to anguish, and a storm shall pass through the soul, shaking it almost to dissolution, and the poor subject thinks, if she can think, that her heart must go to pieces this time. But the storm passes, and nature, instead of being destroyed, is refreshed and ready for the sunshine and the songbirds again. The elastic heart throws off its weight, the spirits revive, and life goes on joyously in harmony with nature. So it was with Jacquelina, with this sad difference, that as her trouble was more than sorrow, for it was remorse, it was never quite thrown off. It was not that her conscience reproached her for the fate of Dr. Grimshaw, which was brought on by his own wrongdoing, but Marian's fate, that a wild, wanton frolic of her own should have caused the early death of one so young and beautiful and good as Marian. That was the thought that nearly drove poor Jacquelina mad with remorse, whenever she realized it. Dr. Grimshaw was forgiven and forgotten, but the thought of Marian was the undying worm that preyed upon her heart. And so, year after year, despite the arguments and persuasions of nearest friends, and the constancy of poor Cloudy, Jacquelina tearfully turned from love, friendship, wealth, and ease, and renewed her vows of poverty, celibacy, obedience, and the service of the poor, sick, and ignorant, in the hope of expiating her offense, soothing the voice of conscience, and gaining peace. Jacquelina would have made her vows perpetual by taking the black veil, but her superior constantly dissuaded her from it. She was young, and life with its possibilities was all before her. She must wait many years before she took the step that could not be retracted without perjury. And so each year she renewed her vow a 12-month. The 7th year of her religious life was drawing to its close, and she had notified her superior of her wish now, after so many years of probation, to take the black veil and make her vows perpetual. And the abbess had at length listened favorably to her expressed wishes. But a few days after this, as the good old mother, Martha, the portress, sat dozing over her rosary behind the hall grating, the outer door was thrown open, and a young man in a midshipman's undress uniform entered rather brusquely, and came up to the grating. Touching his hat precisely as if the old lady had been his superior officer, he said hastily, "Madam, if you please, I wish to see Mrs. You know who I mean, I presume, my cousin Jacquelina." The portress knew well enough, for she had seen Cloudy there several times before, but she replied, "You mean, young gentleman, that pious daughter called in the world Mrs. Grimshaw, but in religion Sister Theresa." "Fal lal, that is, I beg your pardon, mother, but I wish to see the lady immediately. Can I do so?" "The dear Sister Theresa is at present making her retreat, preparatory to taking the black veil." "The what?" exclaimed Cloudy, with as much horror as if it had been the black dose she was going to take. "The black veil, and so she cannot be seen. Madam, I have a very pressing form of invitation here, which people are not very apt to disregard. Did you ever hear of a subpoena, dear mother?" The good woman never had, but she thought it evidently something uncanny, for she said, "I will send for the abbess." And she beckoned to a nun within, and sent her on the errand. And soon the abbess appeared, and Cloudy made known the object of his visit. "Go into the parlor, sir, and Sister Theresa will attend you," said that lady. And Cloudy turned to a side door on his right hand, and went into the little receiving room, 3 sides of which were like the other rooms, but the 4th side was a grating instead of a wall. Behind this grating appeared Jacquelina, so white and thin with confinement, fasting, and vigil, and so disguised by her nun's dress as to be unrecognizable to any but a lover's eyes. With her was the abbess. Cloudy went up to the grating. Jacquelina put her hand through and spoke a kind greeting, but Cloudy glanced at the abbess, looked reproachfully at Jacquelina, and then turning to the former said, "Madam, I wish to say a few words in confidence to my cousin here. Can I be permitted to do so?" "Most certainly, young gentleman. Sister Theresa is not restricted. It was at her own request that I attended her hither." "Thank you, dear lady. That which I have to say to Sister Theresa involves the confidence of others, else I should not have made the request that you have so kindly granted," said Cloudy, considerably mollified. The abbess curtsied in the old stately way and retired. Cloudy looked at Jacquelina reproachfully. "Are you going to be a nun, Lena?" "Yes. Oh, Cloudy, Cloudy, why do you come here to disturb my thoughts so for? Oh, Cloudy, every time you come to see me, you do so upset and confuse my mind. You have no idea how many aves and paters and psalms and litanies I have to say before I can quiet my mind down again. And now this is worse than all. Dear, dear Cloudy, St. Mary forgive me. I never meant that. I mean plain Cloudy. See how you make me sin in words. What did you send Mother E.D.E.N away for? That I might talk to you alone. Why do you deny me that small consolation, Lena? How have I offended that you should treat me so?" "In no way at all have you offended, dearest Cloudy." "St. Peter, there it is again. I mean only Cloudy." "Never mind explaining the distinction. You're going to be a nun, you say. Well, very well, let that pass too. But you must leave your convent and go into the world yet once more, and then I shall have opportunities of talking to you before you return." "No, no, never will I leave my convent. Never will I subject my soul to such a temptation. My dear Lena, I have the cabalistic words that must draw you forth. Listen. Our cousin, Thurston Willcoxen, is in prison, charged with the murder of Marian Mayfield." A stifled shriek from Jacquelina. "And there is circumstantial evidence against him strong enough to ruin him forever, if it doesn't cost him his life. Now, Lena, I cannot be wrong in supposing that you know who struck the death blow, and that your evidence can thoroughly exonerate Thurston from suspicion. Am I right?" "Yes, yes, you are right," exclaimed Jacquelina in great agitation. "You will go then?" "Yes, yes." "When?" "In an hour. This moment, with you." "With me?" "Yes, I may do so in such a case. I must do so. Oh, heaven knows I have occasioned sinned enough, without causing more against poor Thurston." "You will get ready then immediately, dear Lena. Are you sure there will be no opposition?" "Certainly not. Why, Cloudy, are you one of those who credit raw head and bloody bones fables about convents? I have no jailer but my own conscience, Cloudy. Besides, my year's vows expired yesterday, and I am free for a while before renewing them perpetually," said Jacquelina, hurrying away to get ready. "And may I be swung to the yardarm if ever I let you renew them," said Cloudy, while he waited for her. Jacquelina was soon ready, and Cloudy rejoined her in the front entry, behind the grating of which the good old portress, as she watched the handsome middy drive off with her young postulant, devoutly crossed herself and diligently told her beads. Commodore Waugh and his family were returning slowly from the south, stopping at all the principal towns for long rests on their way homeward. The Commodore was now a wretched, helpless old man, depending almost for his daily life upon the care and tenderness of Mrs. Waugh. Good Henrietta, with advancing years, had continued to wax fat, and now it was about as much as she could do, with many grunts, to get up and down stairs. Since her double bereavement of her Hebe and her lapwing, Her kind motherly countenance had lost somewhat of its comfortable jollity, and her hearty mellow laugh was seldom heard. Still, good Henrietta was passably happy, as the world goes, for she had the lucky foundation of a happy temper and temperament. She enjoyed the world, her friends, and her creature comforts, her sound, innocent sleep, her rambling pony, or her easy carriage, her hearty meals, and her dreamy doze in the soft armchair of an afternoon, while Mrs. Luceau droned, in a dreary voice, long homilies for the good of the Commodore's soul. Mrs. Luceau had got to be one of the saddest and maddest fanatics that ever afflicted a family, and there were hours when, by holding up too graphic, terrific, and exasperating pictures of the veteran's past and present wickedness and impenitence, and his future retribution in the shape of an external roasting in the lake that burneth with fire and brimstone, she drove the old man half frantic with rage and fright, and then she would nearly finish him by asking, if hell was so horrible to hear of for a little while, what must it be like to feel for ever and ever? They had reached Charleston on their way home. Mrs. Luceau, too much fatigued to persecute her uncle for his good, had gone to her chamber. The Commodore was put comfortably to bed, and Mrs. Waugh took the day's paper and sat down by the old man's side to read him the news until he should get sleepy. As she turned the paper about, her eyes fell upon the same paragraph that had so agitated Marian. Now Henrietta was by no means excitable. On the contrary, she was rather hard to be moved. But on seeing this announcement of the arrest of Mr. Willcoxen for the crime with which he was charged, an exclamation of horror and amazement burst from her lips. In another moment she had controlled herself, and would gladly have kept the exciting news from the sick man until the morning. But it was too late. The Commodore had heard the unwonted cry, and now, raised upon his elbow, lay staring at her with his great fat eyes, and insisting upon knowing what the foul fiend she meant by screeching out in that manner. It was in vain to evade the question. The Commodore would hear the news, and Mrs. Waugh told him. "And by the bones of Paul Jones, I always believed it," falsely swore the Commodore. And thereupon he demanded to hear all about it. Mrs. Waugh commenced, and in a very unsteady voice read the long account quite through. The Commodore made no comment except an occasional grunt of satisfaction until she had finished it, when he growled out, "Knew it! Hope they'll hang him! Darned rascal! If it hadn't been for him, there'd been no trouble in the family. Now call Festus to help to turn me over, and tuck me up, Henrietta. I want to go to sleep." That night Mrs. Waugh said nothing, but the next morning she proposed hurrying homeward with all possible speed. But the Commodore would hear of no such thing. He swore roundly that he would not stir to save the necks of all the scoundrels in the world, much less that of Thurston, who, if he did not kill Marian, deserved richly to be hanged for giving poor Nace so much trouble. Mrs. Waugh coaxed and urged in vain. The Commodore rather liked to hear her do so, and so the longer she pleaded, the more obstinate and dogged he grew, until at last Henrietta desisted, telling him, very well, justice and humanity alike required her presence near the unhappy man, and so, whether the Commodore chose to budge or not, she should surely leave Charleston in that very evening's boat for Baltimore, so as to reach Leonardtown in time for the trial. Upon hearing this, the Commodore swore furiously, but knowing of old that nothing could turn Henrietta from the path of duty, and dreading above all things to lose her comfortable attentions and be left to the doubtful mercies of Mary Luceau, he yielded, though with the worst possible grace, swearing all the time that he hoped the villain would swing for it yet. And then the trunks were packed, and the travelers resumed their homeward journey. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Missing Bride. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. Southworth, Chapter 36. The Trial. The day of the trial came. It was a bright spring day, and from an early hour in the morning the village was crowded to overflowing with people collected from all parts of the county. The courtroom was filled to suffocation. It was with the greatest difficulty that order could be maintained when the prisoner, in the custody of the high sheriff, was brought into court. The venerable presiding judge was supposed to be unfriendly to the accused, and the state's attorney was known to be personally, as well as officially, hostile to his interests. So strongly were the minds of the people prejudiced upon one side or the other, that it was with much trouble that 12 men could be found who had not made up their opinions as to the prisoner's innocence or guilt. At length, however, a jury was impaneled, and the trial commenced. When the prisoner was placed at the bar and asked the usual question, "Guilty or not guilty?" some of the old haughtiness curled the lip and flashed from the eye of Thurston Willcoxen, as though he disdained to answer a charge so base, and he replied in a low, scornful tone, "Not guilty, your honor." The opening charge of the state's attorney had been carefully prepared. Mr. Thompson had never in his life had so important a case upon his hands, and he was resolved to make the most of it. His speech was well reasoned, logical, and eloquent, to destroy in the minds of the jury every favorable impression left by the late blameless and beneficent life of Mr. Willcoxen. He did not fail to adduce from olden history and from later times every single instance of depravity, cloaked with hypocrisy, in high places. He enlarged upon wolves in sheep's clothing, Satan in an angel's garb, and dolefully pointed out how many times the indignant question of, "Is thy servant a dog, that he should do this thing?" had been answered by results in the affirmative. He raked up David's sin from the ashes of ages. Where was the scene of that crime? And who was its perpetrator in the court of Israel by the King of Israel, a man after God's own heart? Could the gentlemen of the jury be surprised at the appalling discovery so recently made, as if great crimes in high places were impossible, or new things under the sun? He did not fail to draw a touching picture of the victim, the beautiful, young, stranger girl whom they all remembered and loved, who had come, an angel of mercy, on a mission of mercy to their shores. Was not her beauty, her genius, her goodness, by which all there had at some time been blessed, sufficient to save her from the knife of the assassin? No, as he shall shortly prove. And yet all these years her innocent blood had cried to heaven in vain. Her fate was unavenged, her manes unappeased. All the women and all the simple-hearted and unworldly among the men were melted into tears, very unpropitious to the fate of Thurston, tears not called up by the eloquence of the prosecuting attorney so much as by the mere allusion to the fate of Marian, once so beloved and still so fresh in the memories of all. Thurston heard all this, not in the second-hand style with which I have summed it up, but in the first vital freshness, when it was spoken with a logic, force, and fire that carried conviction to many a mind. Thurston looked upon the judge. His face was stern and grave. He looked upon the jury. They were all strangers from distant parts of the county, drawn by idle curiosity to the scene of trial, and arriving quite unprejudiced. They were not his peers, but on the contrary, 12 as stolid-looking brothers as ever decided the fate of a gentleman and scholar. Thence he cast his eye over the crowd in the courtroom. There were his parishioners, hoary patriarchs and gray-haired matrons, stately men and lovely women, who from week to week for many years had still hung delighted on his discourses, as though his lips had been touched with fire, and all his words inspired. There they were around him again, but oh, how different the relations and the circumstances! There they sat, with stern brows and averted faces, or downcast eyes, and lips that scarce their scorn forbore. No eye or lip among them responded kindly to his searching gaze, and Thurston turned his face away again. For an instant his soul sunk under the pall of despair that fell darkening upon it. It was not conviction in the court he thought of. He would probably be acquitted by the court, but what should acquit him in public opinion? The evidence that might not be strong enough to doom him from death would still be sufficient to destroy forever his position and his usefulness. No eye thenceforth would meet his own in friendly confidence, no hand grasp his in brotherly fellowship. The state's attorney was still proceeding with his speech. He was now stating the case, which he promised to prove by competent witnesses, how the prisoner at the bar had long pursued his beautiful but hapless victim, how he had been united to her by a private marriage, that he had corresponded with her from Europe, that upon his return they had frequently met, that the prisoner, with a treachery that would soon be proved to be a part of his nature, had grown weary of his wife and transferred his attentions to another and more fortune-favored lady, and finally, that upon the evening of the murder he had decoyed the unhappy young lady to the fatal spot, and then and there effected his purpose. The prosecuting attorney made the statement not with the brevity with which it is here reported, but with a minuteness of detail and warmth of coloring that harrowed up the hearts of all who heard it. He finished by saying that he should call the witness in the order of time corresponding with the facts they came to prove. Oliver Murphy will take the stand. This, the first witness called, after the usual oath, deposed that he had first seen the prisoner and the deceased together in the Library of Congress, had overheard the conversation, and suspecting some unfairness on the part of the prisoner, had followed the parties to the Navy Yard, where he had witnessed their marriage ceremony. When was the next occasion upon which you saw the prisoner? On the night of the 8th of April, 1828, on the coast, near Pine Bluff. I had landed from a boat and was going inland when I passed him. I didn't see his face distinctly, but recognized him by his size and form and peculiar air and gait. He was hurrying away with every mark of terror and agitation. This portion of Mr. Murray's testimony was so new to all as to excite the greatest degree of surprise, and in no bosom did it arouse more astonishment than in that of Thurston. The witness was strictly cross-questioned by the counsel for the prisoner, but the cross-examination failed to weaken his testimony or to elicit anything more favorable to the accused. Oliver Murray was then directed to stand aside. The next witness was Miriam Shields, deeply veiled and half fainting. The poor girl was led in between Colonel and Miss Thornton, and allowed to sit while giving evidence. When told to look at the prisoner at the bar, she raised her death-like face, and a deep gasping sob broke from her bosom. But Thurston fixed his eyes kindly and encouragingly upon her. His look said plainly, "Fear nothing, dear Miriam. Be courageous. Do your stern duty, and trust in God." Miriam then identified the prisoner as the man she had twice seen alone with Marian at night. She further testified that upon the night of April 8th, 1828, Marian had left home late in the evening to keep an appointment from which she never returned. That in the pocket of the dress she had laid off was found the note appointing the meeting upon the beach for the night in question. Here the note was produced. Miriam identified the handwriting as that of Mr. Willcoxen. Paul Douglas was next called to the stand and required to give his testimony in regard to the handwriting. Paul looked at the piece of paper that was placed before him, and he was sorely tempted. How could he swear to the handwriting unless he had actually seen the hand write it? He asked himself. He looked at his brother, but Thurston saw the struggle in his mind, and his countenance was stern and high, and his look authoritative and commanding. It said, "Paul, do not dare to deceive yourself. You know the handwriting. Speak the truth if it kills me." And Paul did so. The next witness that took the stand was Dr. Brightwell. The good old physician gave his evidence very reluctantly. It went to prove the fact of the prisoner's absence from the deathbed of his grandfather upon the night of the reputed murder, and his distracted appearance when returning late in the morning. "Why do you say reputed murder?" "Because, sir, I never consider the fact of a murder established until the body of the victim has been found. You may stand down." Dr. Solomon Wiseman was next called to the stand and corroborated the testimony of the last witness. Several other witnesses were then called in succession, whose testimony, being only corroborative, was not very important, and the prisoner was remanded and the court adjourned until 10 o'clock the next morning. "Life will be saved, but position and usefulness in this neighborhood gone forever, Paul," said Thurston as they went out. "Evidence very strong, very conclusive to our minds, yet not sufficient to convict him," said one gentleman to another. "I am of honest Dr. Brightwell's opinion that the establishment of a murder needs as a starting point the finding of the body, and moreover that the conviction of a murderer requires an eyewitness to the deed. The evidence, so far as we have heard it, is strong enough to ruin the man, but not strong enough to hang him," said a third. "Aye, but we have not heard all, or the most important part of the testimony. The state's attorney has not fired his great gun yet," said a fourth, as the crowd elbowed and pushed and struggled out of the courtroom. Those from distant parts of the county remained in the village all night. Those nearer returned home to come back in the morning. The second day of the trial. The village was more crowded than before. At 10 o'clock the court opened. The prisoner was shortly afterward brought in, and the prosecution renewed its examination of witnesses. The next witness that took the stand was a most important one. John Miles, captain of the schooner Plover. He deposed that in the month of April, 1828, he was mate in the schooner Blanche, of which his father was the captain. That in said month the prisoner at the bar had hired his father's vessel to carry off a lady whom the prisoner declared to be his own wife. That they were to take her to the Bermudas. That to effect their object, his father and himself had landed near Pine Bluff. The night was dark, yet he soon discerned the lady walking alone upon the beach. They were bound to wait for the arrival of the prisoner and a signal from him before approaching the lady. They waited some time, watching from their cover the lady as she paced impatiently up and down the sands. At length they saw the prisoner approaching. He was closely wrapped up in his cloak, and his hat was pulled over his eyes. But they recognized him well by his air and gait. They drew nearer still, keeping in the shadow, waiting for the signal. The lady and the prisoner met. A few words passed between them, of which he, the deponent, only heard, "Thurston?" "Yes, Thurston." And then the prisoner raised his arm and struck, and the lady fell. His father was a cautious man, and when he saw the prisoner rush up the cliff and disappear, when he saw that the lady was dead, and that the storm was beginning to rage violently, and the tide was coming in, and fearing besides that he should get into trouble, he hurried into the boat and put off and boarded the schooner, and as soon as possible set sail for Bermuda. They had kept away from this coast for years, that is to say, as long as the father lived. John Miles was cross-examined by Mr. Rumford, but without effect. The testimony bore fatally upon the prisoner's cause. The silence of consternation reigned through the crowd. Thurston Willcoxen, when he heard this astounding evidence, first thought that the witness was perjured. But when he looked closely upon his open, honest face, and fearless eye, and free bearing, he saw that no consciousness of falsehood was there, and that he could but grant that the witness, naturally deceived by foregone conclusions, had inevitably mistaken the real murderer for himself. Darker and darker lowered the pall of fate over him. The awful stillness of the court was oppressive, was suffocating. A deathly faintness came upon him, for now, for the first time, he fully realized the awful doom that threatened him. Not long his nature bowed under the burden. His spirit rose to throw it off, and once more the fine head was proudly raised, nor did it once sink again. The last witness for the prosecution was called, and took the stand, and deposed that he lived 10 miles down the coast, on an isolated, obscure place, and that on the 1st of May, 1828, the body of a woman had been found at low tide upon the beach, and that it had the appearance of having been very long in the water. The clothing was respectable. The dress was dark blue stuff, but was faded in spots. There was a ring on the finger, but the hand was so swollen that it could not be got off. His poor neighbors of the coast assembled. They made an effort to get the coroner, but he could not be found, and the state of the body demanded immediate burial. When cross-questioned by Lawyer Rumford, the witness said they had not then heard of any missing or murdered lady, but had believed the body to be that of a shipwrecked passenger until they heard of Miss Mayfield's fate. Miriam was next recalled. She came in as before, supported between Colonel and Miss Thornton. Everyone who saw the poor girl said that she was dying. When examined, she deposed that Marian, when she left home, had worn a blue merino dress, and yes, she always wore a little locket ring on her finger. Drooping and fainting as she was, Miriam was allowed to leave the courtroom, and this closed the evidence of the prosecution. The defense was taken up and conducted with a great deal of skill. Mr. Rumford enlarged upon the noble character his client had ever maintained from childhood to the present time. They all knew him. He had been born and had ever lived among them. What man or woman of them all would have dared to suspect him of such a crime? He spoke warmly of his truth, fidelity, Christian zeal, benevolence, philanthropy, and great public benefits. I have no space nor time to give a fair idea of the logic and eloquence with which Mr. Rumford met the charges of the state's attorney, nor the astute skill with which he tried to break down the force of the evidence for the prosecution. Then he called the witnesses for the defense. They were all warm friends of Mr. Willcoxen. All had known him from boyhood. None would believe that under any possible circumstance he could commit the crime for which he stood indicted. They testified to his well-known kindness, gentleness, and benevolence, his habitual forbearance and command of temper, and even under the most exasperating provocations they swore to his generosity, fidelity, and truthfulness in all the relations of life. In a word, they did the very best they could to save his life and honor, but the most they could do was very little before the force of such evidence as stood arrayed against him. And all men saw that unless an alibi could be proved, Thurston Willcoxen was lost. Oh, for that alibi! Paul Douglas was again undergoing an awful temptation. Why, he asked himself, why should he not perjure his soul and lose it, to save his brother's life and honor from fatal wrong? And if there had not been in Paul's heart a love of truth greater than his fear of hell, his affection for Thurston would have triumphed. He would have perjured himself. The defense here closed. The state's attorney did not even deem it necessary to speak again, and the judge proceeded to charge the jury. They must not, he said, be blinded by the social position, clerical character, youth, talents, accomplishments, or celebrity of the prisoner. With however dazzling a halo these might surround him, they must deliberately, coolly, upon the evidence that had been laid before them, and after due consideration of the case, if there was a doubt upon their minds, they were to let the prisoner have the full benefit of it, Wherever there was the least uncertainty, it was right to lean to the side of mercy. The case was then given to the jury. The jury did not leave the box, but counseled together in a low voice for half an hour, during which a death-like silence, a suffocating atmosphere, filled the courtroom. Thurston alone was calm. His soul had collected all its force to meet the shock of whatever fate might come, honor or dishonor, life or death. Presently the foreman of the jury arose, followed by the others. Every heart stood still. "Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict?" demanded the judge. "Yes, your honor," responded the foreman on the part of his colleagues. "How say you? Is the prisoner at the bar guilty or not guilty?" "Not guilty!" cried the shrill tones of a girl near the outer door, toward which all eyes in astonishment and inquiry were now turned, to see a slight female figure in the garb of a sister of mercy clinging to the arm of Cloudsley Mornington, and who was now pushing and elbowing his way through the crowd toward the bench. All gave way. Many that were seated arose to their feet, and spoke in eager whispers, or looked over each other's heads. "Order! Silence in the court!" shouted the marshal. "Your honor, this lady is a vitally important witness for the defense," said Cloudy, pushing his way into the presence of the judge, leaving his female companion standing before the bench, and then hurrying to the dock, where he grasped the hand of the prisoner, exclaiming breathlessly, "Saved, Thurston, saved!" "Order! Silence!" called out the marshal, by way of making himself agreeable, for there was silence in the court, where all the audience, at least, were more anxious to hear than to speak. "Your honor, I move that the new witness be heard," said Mr. Rumford. "The defense is closed, the charge given to the jury, who have decided upon their verdict," answered the state's attorney. "The verdict has not been rendered. The jury have the privilege of hearing this new witness," said the judge. The jury were unanimous in the resolution to withhold their verdict until they had heard. This being decided, the sister of mercy took the stand, threw aside her long black veil, and revealed the features of Jacquelina, but so pale, weary, anxious, and terrified as to be scarcely recognizable. The usual oath was administered, and while Cloudy stood triumphantly by the side of Mr. Willcoxen, Jacquelina prepared to give her evidence. She was interrupted by a slight disturbance near the door, and the rather noisy entrance of several persons, whom the crowd, on beholding, recognized as Commodore Waugh, his wife, his niece, and his servant. Some among them seemed to insist upon being brought directly into the presence of the judge and jury, but the officer near the door pointed out to them the witness on the stand, waiting to give testimony, and on seeing her they subsided into quietness, and suffered themselves to be set aside for a while. When this was over, a lady, plainly dressed and close veiled, entered, and addressed a few words to the same janitor, but the latter replied, as he had to the others, by pointing to the witness on the stand. The veiled lady seemed to acquiesce, and sat down where the officer directed her. "Order! Silence in the court!" cried the marshal, not to be behindhand. And order and silence reigned when the sister gave in her evidence as follows: "My name is Jacquelina Luceau, not Grimshaw, for I never was the wife of Dr. Grimshaw. I do not like to speak further of myself, yet it is necessary to make my testimony clear. While yet a child, I was contracted to Dr. Grimshaw in a civil marriage which was never ratified. I was full of mischief in those days, and my greatest pleasure was to torment and provoke my would-be bridegroom. Alas, alas, it was to that wanton spirit that all this disaster is owing. Thurston Willcoxen and Marian Mayfield were my intimate friends. On the morning of the 8th of April, 1828, they were both at Luckenough. Thurston left early. After he was gone, Marian chanced to drop a note, which I picked up and read. It was in the handwriting of Thurston Willcoxen, and it appointed a meeting with Marian upon the beach near Pine Bluff for that evening. Here Mr. Rumford placed in her hands the scrap of paper that had already formed such an important part of the evidence against the prisoner. "Is this the note of which you speak?" "Yes, that is the note. And when I picked it up, the wanton spirit of mischief inspired me with a wish to use it for the torment of Dr. Grimshaw, who was easily provoked to jealousy. Oh, I never thought it would end so fatally. I affected to lose the note, and left it in his way. I saw him pick it up and read it. I felt sure he thought, as I intended he should think, it was for me. There were other circumstances also to lead him to the same conclusion. He dropped the note where he had picked it up, and pretended not to have seen it. Afterwards I, in the same way, restored it to Marian. To carry on my fatal jest, I went home in the carriage with Marian to Oldfield Cottage, which stands near the coast. I left Marian there, and set out to return to Luckenough, laughing all the time. Alas, to think that Dr. Grimshaw had gone to the coast to intercept what he supposed to be my meeting with Thurston. Oh God, I never thought such jests could be so dangerous. Alas, alas, he met Marian Mayfield in the dark, and between the storm without and the storm within, the blindness of night and the blindness of rage, he stabbed her before he found out his mistake. And he rushed home with her innocent blood on his hands and clothing. Rushed home and into my presence to reproach me as the cause of his crime, to fill my bosom with undying remorse, and then to die. He had, in the crisis of his passion, ruptured an artery, and he fell, so that the blood found upon his hands and clothing was supposed to be his own. No one knew the secret of his blood guiltiness but myself. In my illness and delirium that followed, I believe I dropped some words that made my aunt, Mrs. Waugh, and Mr. Cloudsley Mornington suspect something, but I never betrayed my knowledge of the dead man's unintentional crime, and would not do so now, but to save the innocent. May I now sit down? No, the state's attorney wanted to take her in hand and cross-examine her, which he began to do severely, unsparingly. But as she had told the exact truth, though not in the clearest style, the more the lawyer sifted her testimony, the clearer and more evident its truthfulness and point became, until there seemed at length nothing to do but acquit the prisoner. But courts of law are proverbially fussy, and now the state's attorney was doing his best to invalidate the testimony of the last witness. Turn we from them to the veiled lady, where she sat in her obscure corner of the room, hearing all this. Oh, who can conceive, far less portray, the joy, the unspeakable joy that filled her heart nearly to breaking? He was guiltless. Thurston, her beloved, was guiltless in intention, as he was indeed. The thought of crime had not been near his heart. His long remorse had been occasioned by what he had unintentionally made her suffer. He was all that he had lately appeared to the world, all that he had at first appeared to her: faithful, truthful, constant, noble, generous. Her heart was vindicated. Her love was not the madness, the folly, the weakness that her intellectual nature had often stamped it to be. Her love was vindicated, for he deserved it all. O joy unspeakable! O joy insupportable! She was a strong, calm, self-governing woman, not wont to be overcome by any event or any emotion, yet now her head, her whole form drooped forward, and she sank upon the low balustrade in front of her seat, weighed down by excess of happiness so absorbing that for a time she forgot everything else. But soon she remembered that her presence was required near the bench to put a stop to the debate between the lawyers, and she strove to quell the tumultuous excitement of her feelings, and to recover self-command before going among them. In the meantime, near the bench, the counsel for the prisoner had succeeded in establishing the validity of the challenged testimony, and the case was once more about to be recommitted to the jury, when the lady, who had been quietly making her way through the crowd toward the bench, stood immediately in front of the judge, raised her veil, and Marian Mayfield stood revealed. With a loud cry, the prisoner sprang upon his feet, but was immediately captured by two officers who fancied he was about to escape. Marian did not speak one word. She could not do so, nor was it necessary. There she stood, alive among them. They all knew her, the judge, the officers, the lawyers, the audience. There she stood, alive among them. It was enough. The audience arose in a mass and said, "Marian! Marian Mayfield!" was the general exclamation as all pressed toward the newcomer. Jacquelina, stunned with a too sudden joy, swooned in the arms of Cloudy, who between surprise and delight had nearly lost his own senses. The people pressed around Marian with exclamations and inquiries. The marshal forgot to be disorderly with vociferations of order, and stood among the rest agape for news. Marian recovered her voice and spoke. "I am not here to give any information. What explanation I have to make is due first of all to Mr. Willcoxen, who has the right to claim it of me when he pleases." And turning around, she moved toward the dock, raising her eyes to Thurston's face and offering her hand. How he met that look, how he clasped that hand, need not be said. Their hearts were too full for speech. The tumult in the courtroom was at length subdued by the rising of the judge to make a speech, a very brief one. "Mr. Willcoxen is discharged, and the court is adjourned." And then the judge came down from his seat, and the officers cried, "Make way for the court to pass," and the way was made. The judge came up to the group and shook hands first with Mr. Willcoxen, whom he earnestly congratulated, and then with Marian, who was an old and esteemed acquaintance, and so bowing gravely he passed out. Still the crowd pressed on, and among them came Commodore Waugh and his family, for whom way was immediately made. Mrs. Waugh wept and smiled and exclaimed, "Oh, Hebe! Oh, Lapwing!" The Commodore growled out certain inarticulate anathemas, which he intended should be taken as congratulations, since the people seemed to expect it of him. And Mary Luceau pulled down her mouth, cast up her eyes, and crossed herself, when she saw the consecrated hand of Sister Teresa clasped in that of Cloudy. But Thurston's high spirit could not brook this scene an instant longer, and love, as well as pride, required its speedy close. Marian was resting on his arm. He felt the clasp of her dear hand. He saw her living face, the angel brow, the clear eyes, the rich auburn tresses rippling around the blooming cheek. He heard her dulcet tones, and yet it seemed like a dream. He needed to realize this happiness. "Friends," he said, "I thank you for the interest you show in us. For those whose faith in me remained unshaken in my darkest hour, I find no words good enough to express what I shall ever feel. But you must all know how exhausting this day has been, and how needful repose is." His eyes here fell fondly and proudly upon Marian. "To this lady on my arm. After tomorrow we shall be happy to see any of our friends at Dell Delight." And bowing slightly from right to left, he led his Marian through the opening crowd. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Missing Bride. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. Southworth, Chapter 37. Reunion. Who shall follow them, or intrude on the sacredness of their reconciliation, or relate with what broken tones and frequent stops and tears and smiles and clinging embraces their mutual explanations were made. At last Marian, raising her head from his shoulder, said, "But I come to you a bankrupt, dear Thurston. I have inherited and expended a large fortune since we parted, and now I am more than penniless, for I stand responsible for large sums of money owed by my orphans' home and emigrants' help, money that I had intended to raise by subscription. Now I thank God abundantly for the wealth that He has given me. Your fortune, dearest Marian, has been nobly appropriated, and for the rest, it is my blessed privilege to assume all of your responsibilities, and I rejoice that they are great. For, sweetest wife and fairest lady, I feel that I can never sufficiently prove how much I love and reverence you, and how much I would and ought to sacrifice for you. And even now, dear Thurston, I come hither, bound on a mission to the western prairies, to find a suitable piece of land for a colony of emigrants. I know it, fairest and dearest lady, I know it all. I will lift that burden from your shoulders too, and all liabilities of yours do I assume. Oh, my dear Marian, with how much joy I will labor with and for you, until all your responsibilities of every sort are discharged, and my liege lady is free to live her own life. This scene took place in the private parlour of the hotel, while Paul Douglas was gone to Colonel Thornton's lodgings to carry the glad tidings to Miriam, and also to procure a carriage for the conveyance of the whole party to Delight. He returned at last, accompanied by Miriam, whom he tenderly conducted into the room, and who, passing by all others, tottered forward and sank weeping at the feet of Mr. Willcoxen, and clasping his knees, still wept, as if her heart would break. Thurston stooped and raised her, pressed the kiss of forgiveness on her young brow, and then whispered, "Miriam, have you forgotten that there is another here who claims your attention?" Took her by the hand and led her to Marian. The young girl was shy and silent, but Marian drew her to her bosom, saying, "Has my baby forgotten me? And so you would have been an avenger, Miriam? Remember all your life, dear child, that such an office is never to be assumed by an erring human creature. Vengeance is mine, and I will repay, saith the Lord." And kissing Miriam fondly, she resigned her to Paul's care, and turned and gave her own hand to Thurston, who conducted her to the carriage, and then returned for little Angel, who all this time had sat demurely in a little parlour chair. They were followed by Paul and Miriam, and so set forth for Delight. But little more remains to be told. Thurston resigned his pastoral charge of the village church, settled up his business in the neighbourhood, procured a discreet woman to keep house at Delight, left Paul, Miriam, and poor Fanny in her care, and set out with Marian on their western journey to select the site for the settlement of her immigrant protégés. After successfully accomplishing this mission, they returned east and embarked for Liverpool, and thence to London, where Marian dissolved her connection with the emigrants' help, and bade adieu to her orphans' home. Thurston made large donations to both these institutions, and Marian saw that her place was well supplied to the orphans' home by another competent woman. Then they returned to America. Their travels had occupied more than 12 months, and their expenses of all sorts had absorbed more than a third of Mr. Willcoxen's princely fortune. Yet with what joy was it lavished by his hand, who felt he could not do too much for his priceless Marian. On their return home, a heartfelt gratification met them. It was that the parish had shown their undiminished confidence in Mr. Willcoxen, and their high appreciation of his services, by keeping his pulpit open for him. And a few days after his settlement at home, a delegation of the vestry waited upon him to solicit his acceptance of the ministry. And after talking with his liege lady, as he fondly and proudly termed Marian, Mr. Willcoxen was well pleased to return a favourable answer. And in a day or two Thurston and Marian were called upon to give decision in another case, to wit, Jacquelina had not returned to Bethlehem, nor renewed her vows, but had doffed her nun's habit for a young lady's dress, and remained at Luckenough. Cloudy had not failed to push her suit with all his might, but Jacquelina still hesitated. She did not know, she said, but she thought she had no right to be happy, as other people had. She had caused so much trouble in the world, she reckoned she had better go back to her convent. And because you unintentionally occasioned some sorrow, now happily over to some people, you would atone for the fault by adding one more to the list of victims, and making me miserable. Bad logic, Lena, and worse religion. Jacquelina did not know. She could not decide. After so many grave errors, she was afraid to trust herself. The matter was then referred of all men in the world to the Commodore, who graciously replied that they might go to the demon for them. But as Cloudy and Lena had no especial business with his satanic majesty, they declined to avail themselves of the permission, and consulted Mrs. Waugh, whose deep, mellow laugh preceded her answer, when she said, "Take heart, Lapwing, take heart, and all the happiness you can possibly get. I have lived a long time, and seen a great many people, good and bad, and though I have sometimes met people who are not so happy as they merited, yet I have never seen any one happier than they deserve to be. And that they cannot be so seems to be a law of nature that ought to reconcile us very much to the apparent flourishing of the wicked." But Mrs. Luceau warned her daughter not to trust to Auntie, who was so good-natured, and although such a misguided woman, that if she had her will, she would do away with all punishment, yes, even with Satan and purgatory. But Jacquelina had much less confidence in Mrs. Luceau than in Mrs. Waugh, and so she told Cloudy, who thought that he had waited already quite long enough, to wait until Marian and Thurston came home. And if they thought it would be right for her to be happy, why, then, maybe she might be. But the matter must be referred to them. And now it was referred to them by the sorely tried Cloudy, and they gave Jacquelina leave to be happy. And she was happy. And as for Cloudy, poor constant fellow, he was so overjoyed that he declared he would petition the legislature to change his name as no longer appropriate, for though his morning had been cloudy enough, his day was going to be a very bright one. When Mrs. Luceau heard of this engagement, she crossed herself and told her beads, and vowed that the world was growing so wicked that she could no longer live in it, and she commenced preparations to retire to a convent, to which in fact she soon after went, and where in strict truth she was likely to be much happier than her nature would permit her to be elsewhere. Cloudy and Lena were very quietly married, and took up their abode at the pleasant farmhouse of Locust Hill, which was repaired and refurnished for their reception. But if the leopard cannot change his spots, nor the Ethiop his skin, neither can the fairy permanently change her nature. For no sooner was Jacko's happiness secured than the elfish spirit, the lightest part of her nature, effervesced to the top. For the torment of Cloudy, Jacko and Cloudy even had one quarrel. It was upon the first occasion after their marriage of his leaving her to join his ship, and when the whilom sister of Charity drove Cloudy nearly frantic by insisting, whether in jest or earnest, no one on earth could tell, upon donning the little middy's uniform and going with him. However, the quarrel happily was never renewed, for before the next time of sailing there appeared a certain tiny Cloudy at home. That made the land quite as dear as the sea to its mother, and this little imp became Mrs. Waugh's especial pet. And if Jacquelina did not train the little scion very straight, at least she did not twist him awry, and she even tried in her fitful, capricious way to reform her own manners that she might form those of her little children. And Mrs. Waugh and dear Marian aided her and encouraged her in her uncertain efforts. About this time Paul and Miriam were united, and went to housekeeping in the pretty villa built for them upon the site of Old Field Cottage by Thurston, and furnished for them by Mrs. Waugh. And a very pleasant country neighborhood they formed, these three young families of Dell Delight, Locust Hill, and the villa. Two other important events occurred in their social circle. First, poor harmless Fanny passed smilingly to her heavenly home, and all thought it very well. And one night Commodore Waugh, after eating a good hearty supper, was comfortably tucked up in bed, and went into a sound, deep sleep, from which he never more awoke. May he rest in peace. But do you think Mrs. Waugh did not cry about it for 2 weeks, and ever after speak of him as the poor, dear Commodore? But Henrietta was of too healthful a nature to break her heart for the loss of a very good man, and it was not likely she was going to do so for the missing of a very uncomfortable one. And so in a week or two more her happy spirits returned, and she began to realize to what freedom, ease, and cheerfulness she had fallen heir. Now she could live and breathe and go and come without molestation. Now, when she wished to open her generous heart to the claims of affection in the way of helping Lapwing or Miriam, who were neither of them very rich, or to the greater claims of humanity in the relief of the suffering poor, or the pardon of delinquent servants, she could do so to her utmost content, and without having to accompany her kind act with a deep sigh at the anticipation of the parlor storm it would raise at home. And though Mrs. Henrietta still waxed fat, her good flesh was no longer an encumbrance to her. The leaven of cheerfulness lightened the whole mass. Mrs. Waugh had brought her old maid Jenny back. Jenny had begged to come home to old mistress, for she said it was "'stonishin' how ageable she felt, though nobody might believe it. She was getting older and older every single day of her life, and she wanted to end her days long old mistress." Old mistress was rich and good, and lucky enough was a quiet, comfortable home, where the old maid was very sure of being lodged, boarded, and clothed almost as well as old mistress herself. Not that these selfish considerations entered largely into Jenny's mind, for she really loved Mrs. Henrietta. And old mistress and old maid were never happier than on some fine clear day, when, seated on their 2 old mules, they ambled along through the forest and over field to spend a day with Lapwing, or with Hebe, or perhaps with the pigeon pair, as they called the new married couple at the villa. Yes, there was a time when Mrs. Henrietta was happier still. It was when, upon some birthday or other festival, she would gather all the young families, Thurston and Hebe, Cloudy and Lapwing, the pigeons, and all the babies, in the big parlor of Luckenough, and sit surrounded by a flock of tiny Lapwings, Hebes, and pigeons, forming a group that our fairy saucily called the Old Hen and Chickens. And what shall we say in taking leave of Thurston and Marian? He had had some faults, as you have seen, but the conquering of faults is the noblest conquest, and he had achieved such a victory. He called Marian the angel of his salvation. Year by year their affection deepened and strengthened, and he drew them closer in heart and soul and purpose. From their home, as from a center, emanated a healthful, beneficent, and elevating influence, happily felt through all their social circle. A lovely family grew around them, and among the beautiful children none were more tenderly nursed or carefully trained than the little waif Angel. And in all the pleasant country neighborhood, the sweetest and the happiest home is that of Dell Delight. End of chapter 37. And this is the end of The Missing Bride by E.D.E.N. Southworth.